Section 1 of the Conjure Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. Section 1 of the Conjure Woman by Charles Waddell CHESNUTT. The Goophered Grapevine. Some years ago my wife was in poor health, and our family doctor, in whose skill and honesty I had implicit confidence, advised a change of climate. I shared, from an unprofessional standpoint, his opinion that the raw winds, the chill rains, and the violent changes of temperature that characterized the winters in the region of the Great Lakes tended to aggravate my wife's difficulty, and would undoubtedly shorten her life if she remained exposed to them. The doctor's advice was that we seek not a temporary place of sojourn, but a permanent residence in a warmer and more equable climate. I was engaged at the time in grape culture in northern Ohio, and as I liked the business and had given it much study, I decided to look for some other locality suitable for carrying it on. I thought of sunny France, of sleepy Spain, of Southern California, but there were objections to them all. It occurred to me that I might find what I wanted in some one of our own Southern states. It was a sufficient time after the war for conditions in the South to have become somewhat settled, and I was enough of a pioneer to start a new industry if I could not find a place where grape culture had been tried. I wrote to a cousin who had gone into the turpentine business in central North Carolina. He assured me, in response to my inquiries, that no better place could be found in the South than the state and neighborhood where he lived. The climate was perfect for health, and, in conjunction with the soil, ideal for grape culture. Labor was cheap, and land could be bought for a mere song. He gave us a cordial invitation to come and visit him while he looked into the matter. We accepted the invitation, and after several days of leisurely travel, the last 100 miles of which were up a river on a sidewheel steamer, we reached our destination, a quaint old town which I shall call Patesville, because, for one reason, that is not its name. There was a red brick market house in the public square with a tall tower, which held a four-faced clock that struck the hours, and from which there pealed out a curfew at 9 o'clock. There were 2 or 3 hotels, a courthouse, a jail, stores, offices, and all the appurtenances of a county seat and a commercial emporium. For while Patesville numbered only 4,000 or 5,000 inhabitants, of all shades of complexion, it was one of the principal towns in North Carolina, and had a considerable trade in cotton and naval stores. This business activity was not immediately apparent to my unaccustomed eyes. Indeed, when I first saw the town, there brooded over it a calm that seemed almost sabbatic in its restfulness, though I learned later on that underneath its somnolent exterior the deeper currents of life, love and hatred, joy and despair, ambition and avarice, faith and friendship, flowed not less steadily than in livelier latitudes. We found the weather delightful at that season, the end of summer, and were hospitably entertained. Our host was a man of means, and evidently regarded our visit as a pleasure, and we were therefore correspondingly at our ease, and in a position to act with the coolness of judgment desirable in making so radical a change in our lives. My cousin placed a horse and buggy at our disposal, and himself acted as our guide until I became somewhat familiar with the country. I found that grape culture, while it had never been carried on to any great extent, was not entirely unknown in the neighborhood. Several planters thereabouts had attempted it on a commercial scale in former years, with greater or less success. But, like most Southern industries, it had felt the blight of war and had fallen into desuetude. I went several times to look at a place that I thought might suit me. It was a plantation of considerable extent that had formerly belonged to a wealthy man by the name of McAdoo. The estate had been for years involved in litigation between disputing heirs, during which period shiftless cultivation had well nigh exhausted the soil. There had been a vineyard of some extent on the place, but it had not been attended to since the war, and had lapsed into utter neglect. The vines, here partly supported by decayed and broken down trellises, were twining themselves among the branches of the slender saplings which had sprung up among them, grew in wild and unpruned luxuriance, and the few scattered grapes they bore were the undisputed prey of the first comer. The site was admirably adapted to grape raising. The soil, with a little attention, could not have been better, and with the native grape, the luscious scuppernong, as my main reliance in the beginning, I felt sure that I could introduce and cultivate successfully a number of other varieties. One day I went over with my wife to show her the place. We drove out of the town over a long wooden bridge that spanned a spreading mill pond, past the long whitewashed fence surrounding the county fairground, and struck into a road so sandy that the horses' feet sank to the fetlocks. Our route lay partly uphill and partly down, for we were in the Sandhill County. We drove past cultivated farms, and then by abandoned fields grown up in scrub oak and short-leaved pine, and once or twice through the solemn aisles of the virgin forest, where the tall pines, well nigh meeting over the narrow road, shut out the sun, and wrapped us in cloistral solitude. Once, at a cross-roads, I was in doubt as to the turn to take, and we sat there waiting 10 minutes. We had already caught some of the native infection of the restlessness for some human being to come along who could direct us on our way. At length a little negro girl appeared, walking straight as an arrow, with a piggin full of water on her head. After a little patient investigation, necessary to overcome the child's shyness, we learned what we wished to know, and at the end of about 5 miles from the town reached our destination. We drove between a pair of decayed gate posts. The gate itself had long since disappeared, and up a straight sandy lane between 2 lines of rotting rail fence, partly concealed by jimson weeds and briers, to the open space where a dwelling house had once stood, evidently a spacious mansion, if we might judge from the ruined chimneys that were still standing, and the brick pillars on which the sills rested. The house itself, we had been informed, had fallen a victim to the fortunes of war. We alighted from the buggy, walked about the yard for a while, and then wandered off into the adjoining vineyard. Upon Annie's complaining of weariness, I led the way back to the yard, where a pine log, lying under a spreading elm, afforded a shady though somewhat hard seat. One end of the log was already occupied by a venerable-looking colored man. He held on his knees a hat full of grapes, over which he was smacking his lips with great gusto, and a pile of grape skins near him indicated that the performance was no new thing. We approached him at an angle from the rear, and were close to him before he perceived us. He respectfully rose as we drew near, and was moving away, when I begged him to keep his seat. "Don't let us disturb you," I said. "There is plenty of room for us all." He resumed his seat with somewhat of embarrassment. While he had been standing, I had observed that he was a tall man, and, though slightly bowed by the weight of years, apparently quite vigorous. He was not entirely black, and this fact, together with the quality of his hair, which was about 6 inches long and very bushy, except on the top of his head, where he was quite bald, suggested a slight strain of other than negro blood. There was a shrewdness in his eyes, too, which was not altogether African, and which, as we afterwards learned from experience, was indicative of a corresponding shrewdness in his character. He went on eating the grapes, but did not seem to enjoy himself quite so well as he had apparently done before he became aware of our presence. "Do you live around here?" I asked, anxious to put him at his ease. "Yas, suh. I lives ders over yonder, behind the next sand hill, on the Lumberton Plank Road." "Do you know anything about the time when this vineyard was cultivated?" "Lawd bless you, suh, I knows all about it. Dey ain't na'er a man in dis settlement w'at won't tell you ole Julius McAdoo was born and raised on dis yer same plantation. Is you de Norvern gentleman w'at's gwine ter buy de ole vineyard?" "I am looking at it," I replied, "but I don't know that I shall care to buy unless I can be reasonably sure of making something out of it." "Well, suh, you is a stranger to me, and I is a stranger to you, and we is bofe strangers to one anudder, but if I 'uz in yo' place I wouldn't buy dis vineyard." "Why not?" I asked. "Well, I don't know whether you believes in conjuring or not. Some of the white folks don't, or says they don't. But the truth of the matter is dat dis yer ole vineyard is goophered." "Is what?" I asked, not grasping the meaning of this unfamiliar word. "Is goophered, conjured, bewitch." He imparted this information with such solemn earnestness, and with such an air of confidential mystery, that I felt somewhat interested, while Annie was evidently much impressed, and drew closer to me. "How do you know it is bewitched?" I asked. "I wouldn't 'spect fer you to beliebe me 'less you know all 'bout de facts, but ef you and young miss dere don't mind listening to a ole nigger run on a minute or two while you're restin', I can 'splain to you how it all happened." We assured him that we would be glad to hear how it all happened, and he began to tell us. At first the current of his memory, or imagination, seemed somewhat sluggish, but as his embarrassment wore off, his language flowed more freely, and the story acquired perspective and coherence. As he became more and more absorbed in the narrative, his eyes assumed a dreamy expression, and he seemed to lose sight of his auditors, and to be living over again in monologue his life on the old plantation. "Ole Mars Dugal' McAdoo," he began, "bought dis place long many year befo' de wah, en I remember well w'en he sot out all dis yer part er de plantation in scuppernon's. De vines growed monst'us fas', en Mars Dugal' made 1,000 gallon er scuppernon wine eve'y year. Now ef dey's anything a nigger lub, nex' ter 'possum en chicken en watermillions, it's scuppernon's. Dey ain' nuffin dat kin stan' up sidin' de scuppernon fer sweetness. Sugar ain't a circumstance to scuppernon. W'en de season is nigh 'bout ober, en de grapes begin ter swivel up des a little wid de wrinkles er old age, w'en de skin gits soft en brown, den de scuppernon make you smack yo' lip en roll yo' eye en wush fer mo'. So I reckon it ain't very 'stonishin' dat niggers love scuppernon. Dey wuz a sight er niggers in de neighborhood er de vimyard. Dey wuz ole Mars Henry Braboy's niggers, en ole Mars Jeems McLean's niggers, en Mars Dugal's own niggers. Den dey wuz a settlement er free niggers en po' buckras down by de Wilmington Road, en Mars Dugal's had de only vimyard in de neighborhood. I reckon it ain't so much nowadays, but befo' de war en slab'ry times, a nigger didn't min' goin' 5 or 10 mile in de night w'en dey wuz somethin' good to eat at de udder end. So atter a w'ile Mars Dugal' begun to miss his scuppernon's. Co'se he 'cused de niggers er it, but dey all denied it to de las'. Mars Dugal' sot spring guns en steel traps, en he en de overseer sot up nights once or twice, till one night Mars Dugal', he's a monst'us careless man, got his leg shot full of cow peas, but somehow er nudder dey couldn't neber ketch none er de niggers. I don't know how it happened, but it happened des like I tell you, en de grapes kep' on a goin' des de same. But bimeby ole Mars Dugal' fix up a plan to stop it. Dey wuz a Conjure Woman livin' down 'mongs' de free niggers on de Wilmington Road, en all de darkies from Rockfish to Beaver Crick wuz 'feared er her. She could work de mos' powerfulest kin' er goopher, could make people have fits, rheumatiz, er make 'em des dwindle away en die, en dey say she went out ridin' de niggers at night, fer she wuz a witch 'sides bein' a Conjure Woman. Mars Dugal' hearn 'bout Aun Peggy's doin's, and began to reflect whether or no he couldn't get her to help him keep the niggers off in the grapevines. One day, in the spring of the year, old Miss pack up a basket of chicken and pound cake and a bottle of scuppernong wine, and Mars Dugal tuck it in his buggy and drive over to Aun Peggy's cabin. He took the basket in and had a long talk with Aun Peggy. The next day, Aunt Peggy come up to the vineyard. The niggers seed her slipping round, and they soon found out what she was doing there. Mars Dugal had hired her to goofer the grapevines. She sanded round amongst the vines and took a leaf from this one and a grape hole from that one and a grape seed from another one, and then a little twig from here and a little pinch of dirt from there, and put it all in a big black bottle with a snake's tooth and a speckled hen's gall and some hairs from a black cat's tail, and then filled the bottle with scuppernong wine. When she got the goofer all ready and fixed, she took and went out in the woods and buried it under the root of a red oak tree, and then come back and told one of the niggers she done goophered the grapevines. And there a nigger what eat them grapes would be sure to die inside 12 months. After that, the niggers let the scuppernongs alone, and Mars Dugal didn't have no occasion to find no more fault. And the season was most gone when a strange gentleman stopped at the plantation one night to see Mars Dugal on some business. And his coachman, seeing the scuppernongs growing so nice and sweet, slipped round behind the smokehouse and ate all the scuppernongs he could hold. Nobody didn't notice it at the time, but that night, on the way home, the gentleman's horse runned away and killed the coachman. When we heard the news, Aunt Lucy, the cook, she up and say she see the strange nigger eating of the scuppernongs behind the smokehouse. And then we knowed the goofer had been a-working. Then one of the nigger childrens runned away from the quarters one day and got in the scuppernongs and died the next week. White folks say he died of a fever, but the niggers knowed it was the goofer. So you can be sure the darkies didn't have much to do with them scuppernong vines. When the scuppernong season was over for that year, Mars Dugal found he had made 1,500 gallons of wine, and one of the niggers heard him laughing with the overseer fit to kill, and saying them 1,500 gallons of wine was monstrous good interest on the $10 he laid out on the vineyard. So I allows he paid Aunt Peggy $10 for the goofer the grapevines. The goofer didn't work no more till the next summer, when long towards the middle of the season, one of the field hands died. And as that let Mars Dugal short of hands, he went off to town for to buy another. He fetched a new nigger home with him. He was a old nigger, the cutter of a ginger cake, and bald as a hoss apple on the top of his head. He was a pert old nigger, though. He could do a big day's work. Now, it happened that one of the niggers on the next plantation, one of old Mars Henry Brayboy's niggers, had run away the day before and took to the swamp, and old Mars Dugal and some of the other neighbor white folks had gone out with the guns and the dogs for to help 'em hunt for the nigger. And the hands on our own plantation was all so flusterated that we forgot to tell the new hand about the goofer on the scuppernong vines. 'Cause he smelled the grapes and see the vines, and at the dark, the first thing he done was to slip off to the grapevines without saying nothing to nobody. Next morning he told some of the niggers about the fine bait of scuppernong he ate the night before. When they told him about the goofer on the grapevines, he is that terrified that he turned pale and looked just like he going to die right in his tracks. The overseer come up and asked what is the matter, and when they told him Henry been eating of the scuppernongs and he got goofer on him, he gin Henry a big drink of whiskey and 'lowed that the next rainy day he'd take him over to Aunt Peggy's and see if she wouldn't take the goofer off'n him, seeing as he didn't know nothing about it till he done ate the grapes. Sure enough, it rained the next day, and the overseer went over to Aunt Peggy's with Henry. And Aunt Peggy said that being as Henry didn't know about the goofer and ate the grapes in ignorance of the consequences, she reckoned she might be able for to take the goofer off'n him. So she fetched out a bottle with some conjure medicine in it and poured some out in a gourd for Henry to drink. He managed to get it down. He say it tastes like whiskey with something bitter in it. She 'lowed that to keep the goofer off'n him till next spring, but when the sap began to rise in the grapevines, he had to come and see her again, and she tell him what else to do. Next spring, when the sap commenced to rise in the scuppernong vine, Henry took a ham one night. Where'd he get the ham, I don't know. They wasn't no hams on the plantation exceptin' what is in the smokehouse, but I never see Henry 'bout the smokehouse. But as I was sayin', he took the ham over to Aun Peggy's, and Aun Peggy told him that when Mars Dugal began to prune the grapevines, he must go and take and scrape off the sap where it ooze out of the cuttings of the vines, and anoint his bald head with it. And if he do that once a year, the goopher wouldn't work agin him long as he done it. And bein' as he fetch her the ham, she fix it so he can eat all the scuppernong he won't. So Henry gnawed his head with the sap out in the big grapevine just halfway twixt the quarters and the big house, and the goopher never wuck agin him that summer. But the beatin'est thing you ever see happen to Henry. Up to that time he was as bald as a sweetened tater, but just as soon as the young leaves begun to come out on the grapevines, the hair began to grow out on Henry's head, and by the middle of the summer he had the biggest head of hair on the plantation. Before that, Henry had tolerable good hair around the edges, but soon as the young grapes began to come, Henry's hair began to curl all up in little balls just like his here regular grappy hair, and by the time the grapes got ripe his head looked just like a bunch of grapes. Combing it didn't do no good. He work at it half the night with a Jim Crow and think he'd get it straightened out, but in the morning the grapes would be there just the same. So he gin it up and tried to keep the grapes down by having his hair cut short. Footnote: a small card, resembling a currycomb in construction, and used by negroes in the rural districts instead of a comb. End footnote. But that wasn't the queerest thing about the goopher. When Henry come to the plantation, he was getting a little old and stiff in the joints. But that summer he got just as spry and lively as any young nigger on the plantation. Fact, he got so bigoted that Mars Jackson, the overseer, had to threaten to whip him if he didn't stop cutting up his dittos and behave himself. But the most curious thing happened in the fall, when the sap began to go down in the grapevines. First, when the grapes was gathered, the knots began to straighten out in Henry's hair, and when the leaves began to fall, Henry's hair commenced to drap out. And when the vines was bare, Henry's head was balder than it was in the spring, and he began to get old and stiff in the joints again, and paid no more attention to the gals during the whole winter. And next spring, when he rubbed the sap on again, he got young again, and so supple and lively that none of the young niggers on the plantation couldn't jump, nor dance, nor hoe as much cotton as Henry. But in the fall of the year, his grapes meant to straighten out, and his joints to get stiff, and his hair drop off, and the rheumatic began to wrestle with him. Now if you'd a knowed on Mars Dugal McAdoo, you'd a knowed that it had to be a mighty rainy day when he couldn't find something for his niggers to do, and it had to be a mighty little hole he couldn't crawl through, and had to be a monstrous cloudy night when a dollar get by him in the darkness. And when he see how Henry get young in the spring and old in the fall, he 'lowed to hisself as how he could make more money out'n Henry than by working him in the cotton field. 'Long the next spring, after the sap meant to rise and Henry anointed his head and started for to get young and supple, Massa Dugal up and took Henry to town and sold him for $1,500. 'Cause the man what bought Henry didn't know nuffin 'bout the goopher, and Mars Dugal didn't see no 'casion for to tell him. 'Long to'ds the fall, when the sap went down, Henry began to get old again, same as usual, and his new master began to get scared less'n he gwine to lose his $1,500 nigger. He sent for a mighty fine doctor, but the medicine didn't 'pear to do no good. The goopher had a good holt. Henry told the doctor about the goopher, but the doctor just laughed at him. One day in the winter, Mars Dugal went to town, and was santering along the main street when who should he meet but Henry's new master. They said howdy, and Mars Dugal asked him to have a cigar. And after they run on a while about the craps and the weather, Mars Dugal asked him sort of careless, like as if he just thought of it, "How you like the nigger I sold you last spring?" Henry's master shook his head and knocked the ashes off in his cigar. "Spec I made a bad bargain when I bought that nigger. Henry done good work all the summer, but since the fall set in, he appears to be sort of pining away. There ain't nothing particular the matter with him, leastways the doctor say so, 'ceptin' a touch of the rheumatiz, but his hair's all fell out, and if he don't pick up his strength mighty soon, I spec I'm gwine to lose him.' Dey smoked on a while, and by ole Mars say, 'Well, a bargain's a bargain, but you and me is good friends, and I don't want to see you lose all the money you paid for that nigger, and if what you say is so, and I ain't sputting it, he ain't wuth much now. I specs you worked him too hard this summer, or else the swamps down here don't agree with the sand hill nigger. So you just let me know, and if he gets any wusser, I'll be willing to give you $500 for him, and take my chances on his living.' Sure enough, when Henry begun to draw up with the rheumatiz, and it looked like he going to die for sure, his new massa sent for Massa Dugal, and Massa Dugal give him what he promised, and brung Henry home again. He took good care of him during the winter, give him whiskey to rub his rheumatiz and tobacco to smoke, and all he want to eat, 'cause a nigger what he could make $1,000 a year off and didn't grow on every huckleberry bush. Next spring, when the sap rise and Henry's hair commenced to sprout, Mars Dugal sold him again down in Robeson County this time, and he kept that selling business up for 5 year or more. Henry never say nuffin 'bout the goofer to his new masters, 'cause he know he gonna be took good care of the next winter when Massa Dugal buy him back, and Massa Dugal made enough money off'n Henry to buy another plantation over on Beaver Crick. But long 'bout the end of that 5 year, dey come a stranger to stop at the plantation. The first day he is here, he went out with Mars Dugal and spent all the morning looking over the vineyard, and after dinner they spent all the evening playing cards. The niggers soon 'scovered that he was a Yankee, and that he come down to North Carolina for to learn the white folks how to raise grapes and make wine. He promised Mars Dugal he could make the grapevines bear twice as many grapes, and that the new wine press he was a-sellin' would make more than twice as many gallons of wine. And old Massa Dugal just drunk it all in, just appeared to be bewitched by that Yankee. When the darkies see that Yankee running round the vineyard and digging under the grapevines, they shook their heads and 'lowed that they feared Mars Dugal losing his mind. Mars Dugal had all the dirt dug away from under the roots of all the scuppernum vines and let 'em stand that way for a week or more. Then that Yankee made the niggers fix up a mixture of lime and ashes and manure and pour it round the roots of the grapevines. Then he advised Mars Dugal for to trim the vines closer, and Mars Dugal took and done everything the Yankee told him to do. During all this time, mind you, this here Yankee was living off in the fat of the land at the big house, and playing cards with Mars Dugal every night, and they say Mars Dugal lost more than $1,000 during the week that Yankee was a-ruining the grapevines. When the sap rise next spring, old Henry anointed his head as usual, and his hair commenced to grow just the same as it done every year. The scuppernum vines growed monstrous fast, and the leaves was greener and thicker than they ever been during my remembrance. And Henry's hair growed out thicker than ever, and it 'peared to get younger and younger, and suppler and suppler. And seeing as he was short of hands that spring, having took in considerable new ground, Mars Dugal concluded he wouldn't sell Henry till he get the crap in and the cotton chop, so he kept Henry on the plantation. But long 'bout time for the grapes to come on the scuppernum vines, they 'peared to come a change over 'em. The leaves withered and swivel up, and the young grapes turned yeller, and by everybody on the plantation could see that the whole vineyard was dying. Mars Dugal took and watered the vines and done all he could, but it wa'n't no use. That Yankee had done bust a watermelon. One time the vines picked up a bit, and Mars Dugal 'lowed they was going to come out again, but that Yankee done dug too close under the roots, and pruned the branches too close to the vine, and all that lime and ashes done burnt the life out'n the vines, and they jest keep a witherin' and a swivelin'. All this time the goofer was a-workin'. When the vines started to wither, Henry 'mence to complain of his rheumatiz, and when the leaves began to dry up, his hair 'mence to drap out. When the vines fresh up a bit, Henry'd get peart again, and when the vines withered again, Henry'd get old again, and just kept getting mo' and mo' fitting for nothing. He just pined away and finally took to his cabin. And when the big vine, where he got the sap to anoint his head, withered and turned yellow and died, Henry died too. Just went out sort of like a candle. There didn't appear to be nothing the matter with him, excepting the rheumatiz, but his strength just dwindled away till he didn't have enough left to draw his breath. The goofer had got on the boat and throwed Henry that time for good and all. Mars Dugal took on mightily about losing his vimes and his nigger in the same year, and he swore that if he could get hold of that Yankee, he'd wear him to a frazzle, and then chaw up the frazzle. And he done it, too, for Mars Dugal's a monstrous brash man when he once gets started. He sought the vineyard out over again, but it was 3-4 years before the vimes got to bearing any scuppernings. When the war broke out, Mars Dugal raised a company and went off to fight the Yankees. He say he was mighty glad that war come, and he does want to kill a Yankee for every dollar he lost long of that grape-raising Yankee. And I expect he would have done it, too, if the Yankees hadn't suspicioned something and killed him first. After the surrender, old Miss moved to town. The niggers all scattered away from the plantation, and the vineyard ain't been cultivated since. "Is that story true?" asked Annie doubtfully, but seriously, as the old man concluded his narrative. "It's just as true as I'm a-sitting here, miss. There's a easy way to prove it. I can lead the way right to Henry's grave over yonder in the plantation burying ground. And I'll tell you what, massa, I wouldn't advise you to buy this here old vineyard, 'cause the goofer's on it yet, and there ain't no telling when it's going to crap out." "But I thought you said all the old vines died." "They did appear to die, but a few of 'em come out again, and is mixed in 'mongst the others. I ain't scared to eat the grapes, 'cause I knows the old vines from the new ones. But with strangers, there ain't no telling what might happen. I wouldn't advise you to buy this vineyard." I bought the vineyard, nevertheless, and it has been for a long time in a thriving condition, and is often referred to by the local press as a striking illustration of the opportunities open to Northern capital in the development of Southern industries. The luscious scuppernong holds first rank among our grapes, though we cultivate a great many other varieties, and our income from grapes packed and shipped to the Northern markets is quite considerable. I have not noticed any developments of the goofer in the vineyard, although I have a mild suspicion that our colored assistants do not suffer from want of grapes during the season. I found when I bought the vineyard that Uncle Julius had occupied a cabin on the place for many years, and derived a respectable revenue from the product of the neglected grapevines. This doubtless accounted for his advice to me not to buy the vineyard, though whether it inspired the goofer story I am unable to state. I believe, however, that the wages I paid him for his services as coachman, for I gave him employment in that capacity, were more than an equivalent for anything he lost by the sale of the vineyard. End of the Goophered Grapevine. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 2 of the Conjure Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. Section 2 of The Conjure Woman by Charles Waddell CHESNUTT. Poe Sandy. On the northeast corner of my vineyard in central North Carolina and fronting on the Lumberton Plank Road, there stood a small frame house of the simplest construction. It was built of pine lumber, and contained but one room, to which one window gave light, and one door admission. Its weather-beaten sides revealed a virgin innocence of paint. Against one end of the house, and occupying half its width, there stood a huge brick chimney. The crumbling mortar had left large cracks between the bricks. The bricks themselves had begun to scale off in large flakes, leaving the chimney sprinkled with unsightly blotches. These evidences of decay were but partially concealed by a creeping vine, which extended its slender branches hither and thither in an ambitious but futile attempt to cover the whole chimney. The wooden shutter, which had once protected the unglazed window, had fallen from its hinges, and lay rotting in the rank grass and jimson weeds beneath. This building, I learned when I bought the place, had been used as a schoolhouse for several years prior to the breaking out of the war, since which time it had remained unoccupied, save when some stray cow or vagrant hog had sought shelter within its walls from the chill rains and nipping winds of winter. One day my wife requested me to build her a new kitchen. The house, erected by us when we first came to live upon the vineyard, contained a very conveniently arranged kitchen, but for some occult reason my wife wanted a kitchen in the backyard, apart from the dwelling house, after the usual Southern fashion. Of course, I had to build it. To save expense, I decided to tear down the old schoolhouse, and use the lumber, which was in a good state of preservation, in the construction of the new kitchen. Before demolishing the old house, however, I made an estimate of the amount of material contained in it, and found that I would have to buy several hundred feet of lumber additional, in order to build the new kitchen according to my wife's plan. One morning old Julius McAdoo, our colored coachman, harnessed the gray mare to the rockaway, and drove my wife and me over to the sawmill from which I meant to order the new lumber. We drove down the long lane which led from our house to the plank road. Following the plank road for about a mile, we turned into a road running through the forest and across the swamp to the sawmill beyond. Our carriage jolted over the half-rotted corduroy road which traversed the swamp, and then climbed the long hill leading to the sawmill. When we reached the mill, the foreman had gone over to a neighboring farmhouse, probably to smoke or gossip, and we were compelled to await his return before we could transact our business. We remained seated in the carriage, a few rods from the mill, and watched the leisurely movements of the mill hands. We had not waited long before a huge pine log was placed in position. The machinery of the mill was set in motion, and the circular saw began to eat its way through the log, with a loud whir, which resounded throughout the vicinity of the mill. The sound rose and fell in a sort of rhythmic cadence, which, heard from where we sat, was not unpleasing, and not loud enough to prevent conversation. When the saw started on its second journey through the log, Julius observed in a lugubrious tone, and with a perceptible shudder, but dat just do cuddle my blood." "What's the matter, Uncle Julius?" inquired my wife, who is of a very sympathetic turn of mind. "Does the noise affect your nerves?" "No, Miss Annie," replied the old man with emotion. "I ain't nervous, but dat saw, cuttin' and grindin' through dat stick of timber, and moanin' and groanin' and squeakin', carries my 'members back to old times, and minds me of po' Sandy." The pathetic intonation with which he lengthened out the "po' Sandy" touched a responsive chord in our own hearts. "And who was poor Sandy?" asked my wife, who takes a deep interest in the stories of plantation life which she hears from the lips of the older colored people. Some of these stories are quaintly humorous, others wildly extravagant, revealing the oriental cast of the negro's imagination, while others, poured freely into the sympathetic ear of a northern-bred woman, disclose many a tragic incident of the darker side of slavery. "Sandy," said Julius, replying to my wife's question, "was a nigger w'at used to belong to ole Mars Marrable McSwain. Mars Marrable's place was on the other side of the swamp, right next to yo' place. Sandy was a monstrous good nigger, and could do so many things there about the plantation, and allers tend to his work so well, dat when Mars Marrable's chilluns growed up and married off, dey all of dem wanted dey daddy fer to gin 'em Sandy for a weddin' present. But Mars Marrable knowed the rest wouldn't be satisfied if he gin Sandy to e'ry one of 'em. So when they was all done mad, he fixed it by allowing one of his chillins to take Sandy for a month or so, and then another for a month or so on that way till they had all had him the same length of time. And then they would all take him round again, 'ceptin' once in a while when Mars Marrabo would lend him to some of his other kinfolks round the country, when they was short of hands. Till by and by it got so Sandy didn't hardly know where he was going to stay from one week's end to the other. One time, when Sandy was lent out as usual, a speculator come along with a lot of niggers, and Mars Marrabo swapped Sandy's wife off for a new woman. When Sandy come back, Mars Marrabo get him $1 and 'lowed he was monstrous sorry for the breakup of the family, but the speculator had get him big boot, and times was hard and money scarce, and so he was bleedzed to make a trade. Sandy took on some 'bout losing his wife, but he soon seed they wa'n't no use crying over spilt molasses, and being as he lacked the looks of the new woman, he took up with her after she been on the plantation a month or so. Sandy and his new wife got on mighty well together, and the niggers all mensed to talk about how loving they was. When Tenny was took sick once, Sandy used to sit up all night with her, and then go to work in the morning just like he had his regular sleep, and Tenny would have done anything in the world for her Sandy. Sandy and Tenny hadn't been living together for more than 2 months before Mars Marrabo's old uncle, what lived down in Robeson County, sent up to find out if Mars Marrabo couldn't lend him or hire him a good hand for a month or so. Sandy's master was one of these here easy-going folks what want to please everybody, and he says yes, he could lend him Sandy. And Mars Marrabo told Sandy for to get ready to go down to Robeson next day for to stay a month or so. It was monstrous hard on Sandy for to take him away from Tenny. It was so far down to Robeson that he didn't have no chance of coming back to see her till the time was up. He wouldn't have mind coming 10 or 15 mile at night to see Tenny, but Mars Marrabo's uncle's plantation was more than 40 mile off. Sandy was mighty sad and cast down after what Mars Marrabo told him, and he says to Tenny, says he, "I'm getting monstrous tired of this here going round so much. Here I is lent to Mars Jeems this month, and I got to do so, and to Mars Archie the next month, and I got to do so, then I got to go to Miss Jenny's. And it's Sandy this and Sandy that, and Sandy yeah and Sandy there, till it 'pears to me I ain't got no home, ner no master, ner no mistress, ner no nothing. I can't even keep a wife. My other old woman was sold away without my getting a chance for to tell her goodbye. And now I got to go off and leave you, Tenny, and I don't know whether I'm ever going to see you again. And no, I wish I was a tree, a stump, or a rock, or something what could stay on the plantation for a while." After Sandy got through talking, Tenny didn't say ne'er a word, but just sat there by the fire studying and studying. By and by she up and says, "Sandy, is I ever told you I was a Conjure Woman?" 'Course Sandy hadn't never dreamt of nothing like that, and it made a great moderation when he hear what Tenny say. By and by Tenny went on. "I ain't goofed nobody, ner done no conjure work for 15 year or more, and when I got religion I made up my mind I wouldn't work no more goofer. But they is some things I don't believe is no sin for to do. And if you don't want to be sent round from pillar to post, and if you don't want to go down to Robeson, I can fix things so you won't have to. If you'll just say the word, I can turn you to whatever you want to be, and you can stay right where you want to, as long as you mind to." Sandy say he don't care. He's willing for to do anything for to stay close to Tenny. Then Tenny asks him if he don't want to be turned into a rabbit. Sandy say, "Nah, the dogs might get after me." "Shall I turn you to a wolf?" says Tenny. "Nah, everybody's scared of a wolf, and I don't want nobody to be scared of me." "Shall I turn you to a mockingbird?" "Nah, a hawk might catch me. I want to be turned into something what'll stay in one place." "I can turn you to a tree," says Tenny. "You won't have no mouth nor ears, but I can turn your back once in a while so you can get something to eat and hear what's going on." Well, Sandy say that'll do, and so Tenny took him down by the edge of the swamp, not far from the quarters, and turned him into a big pine tree, and sought him out 'mongst some other trees. And the next morning, as some of the field hands was going along there, they seed a tree what they didn't 'member having seed before. It was monstrous queer, and they was bleezed to 'low that they hadn't 'membered right, or else one of the saplings had been growing monstrous fast. When Mars Marrabo discovered that Sandy was gone, he 'lowed Sandy had run away. He got the dogs out, but the last place they could track Sandy to was the foot of that pine tree. And there the dogs stood and barked and bayed and pawed at the tree and tried to climb up on it. And when they was took round through the swamp to look for the scent, they broke loose and made for that tree again. It was the beatin'est thing the white folks ever hearn of, and Mars Marrabo 'lowed that Sandy must have climbed up on the tree and jump off on a mule or something and rid fur enough for to spoil the scent. Mars Marrabo wanted to accuse some of the other niggers of helping Sandy off, but they all nighted to the last, and everybody knowed Tenny sot too much store by Sandy for to help him run away while she couldn't never see him no more. When Sandy had been gone long enough for folks to think he done got clean away, Tenny used to go down to the woods at night and turn him back, and then they'd slip up to the cabin and set by the fire and talk. But they had to be monstrous careful, or else somebody would have seed 'em, and that would have spoilt the whole thing. So Tenny allers turned Sandy back in the morning early, before anybody was a-stirring. But Sandy didn't get along without his trials and tribulations. One day a woodpecker come along and minced a peck at the tree, and the next time Sandy was turns back, he had a little round hole in his arm, just like a sharp stick been stuck in it. After that, Tenny sot a sparrowhawk fer to watch the tree, and when the woodpecker come along next morning fer to finish his nest, he got gobbled up most 'fore he stuck his bill in the bark. 'Nother time, Mars Marrabo sent a nigger out in the woods fer to chop turpentine boxes. The man chop a box in dish here tree and hack the bark up 2 or 3 feet fer to let the turpentine run. The next time Sandy was turnt back, he had a big scar on his left leg, just like it been skunt. And it took Tenny nigh about all night fer to fix a mixtry to cure it up. After dat, Tenny sot a hornet fer to watch the tree, and when the nigger come back again fer to cut another box on the other side of the tree, the hornet stung him so hard that the axe slipped and cut his foot nigh about off. When Tenny see so many things happening to the tree, she concluded she had to turn Sandy to something else, and after studying the matter over and talking with Sandy one evening, she made up her mind for to fix up a goopher mixture what would turn herself and Sandy to foxes, or something, so they could run away and go somewheres where they could be free and live like white folks. But there ain't no telling what's going to happen in this world. Tenny had got the night sought for her and Sandy to run away, when that very day one of Mars Marrabo's sons rid up to the big house in his buggy, and say his wife was monstrous sick, and he want his mammy to lend him a woman for to nuss his wife. Tenny's mistress say send Tenny. She was a good nurse. Young Mars was in a terrible hurry for to get back home. Tenny was washing at the big house that day, and the mistress say she should go right along with her young massa. Tenny tried to make some excuse for to get away and hide till night, when she would have everything fixed up for her and Sandy. She say she want to go to her cabin for to get her bonnet. Her mistress say it don't matter about the bonnet. Her head hanker was good enough. Then Tenny say she want to get her best frock. Her mistress say no, she don't need no more frock, and when that one got dirty, she could get a clean one where she was going. So Tenny had to get in the buggy and go along with young Marse Duncan to his plantation, which was mo' than 20 mile away, and they wasn't no chance of her seeing Sandy no more till she come back home. The po' gal felt monstrous bad 'bout the way things was going on, and she knowed Sandy must be a-wondering why she didn't come turning back no more. Whiles Tenny was away nussin' young Mars Duncan's wife, Mars Marrabo took a notion for to build him a new kitchen, and being as he had lots of timber on his place, he begun to look round for a tree to have the lumber sawed outen. And I don't know how it come to be so, but it happened for to hit on the very tree what Sandy was turns into. Tenny was gone, and they wa'n't nobody ner nuffin for to watch the tree. The two men what cut the tree down say they never had such a time with a tree before. They axes would glance off, and didn't 'pear to make no progress through the wood. And of all the creaking and shaking and wobbling you ever see, that tree done it when it commenced to fall. It was the beatin'est thing. When they got the tree all trim up, they chained it up to a timber wagon and start for the sawmill. But they had a hard time getting a log there. First they got stuck in the mud when they was going across the swamp, and it was 2 or 3 hours before they could get it out. When they start on again, the chain kept a-comin' loose, and they had to keep a-stoppin' and a-stoppin' for to hitch the log up again. When they commenced to climb the hill to the sawmill, the log broke loose and rolled down the hill in amongst the trees, and it took nigh about half a day more to get it hauled up to the sawmill. The next morning, after the day the tree was hauled to the sawmill, Tenny come home. When she got back to her cabin, the first thing she done was to run down to the woods and see how Sandy was getting on. When she seed the stump standing there, with the sap running out in it and the limbs laying scattered round, she nigh about went out in her mind. She run to her cabin and got a gopher mixture, and then followed the track of the timber wagon to the sawmill. She knowed Sandy couldn't live more than a minute or so if she turns him back, for he was all chop up, so he'd have been bleached to die. But she wanted to turn him back long enough for to explain to him that she hadn't went off a purpose and left him to be chopped down and sawed up. She didn't want Sandy to die with no hard feelings towards her. The hands at the sawmill had just got the big log on the carriage and was starting up the saw when they seed a woman running up the hill, all out of breath, crying and going on just like she was plumb 'stracted. It was Tenny. She come right into the mill and throwed herself on the log, right in front of the saw, a-hollering and crying to her Sandy to forgive her and not to think hard of her, for it wa'n't no fault of hern. Then Tenny 'membered the tree didn't have no years, and she was getting ready for to work her gopher mixture so as to turn Sandy back, when the mill hands cotch hold of her and tied her arms with a rope and fastened her to one of the posts in the sawmill. And then they started to saw up again and cut the log up into boards and scantlings right before her eyes. But it was mighty hard work, for of all the squeaking and moaning and groaning, that log done it whiles the saw was a-cutting through it. The saw was one of these here old-timey up-and-down saws, and it took longer them days to saw a log than it do now. They greased the saw, but that didn't stop the fuss. It kept right on, till finally they got the log all sawed up. When the overseer would run the sawmill come from breakfast, the hands up and tell him about the crazy woman, as they s'posed she was, what had come running in the sawmill, a-hollering and going on, and tried to throw herself before the saw. And the overseer sent 2 or 3 of the hands for to take Tenny back to her master's plantation. Tenny appeared to be out in her mind for a long time, and her master had to lock her up in the smokehouse till she got over her spells. Mars Marrabo was monstrous mad, and it would have made your flesh crawl for to hear him cuss, 'cause he say the speculator what he got Tenny from had fooled him by working a crazy woman off on him. Whilst Tenny was locked up in the smokehouse, Mars Marrabo took and hauled the lumber from the sawmill and put up his new kitchen. When Tenny got quiet down so she could be 'lowed to go round the plantation, she up and told her master all about Sandy and the pine tree. And when Mars Marrabo hearn it, he 'lowed she was the worst 'stracted nigger he ever hearn of. He didn't know what to do with Tenny. First he thought he'd put her in the po'house, but finally, seeing as she didn't do no harm to nobody ner nuffin, but just went around moaning and groaning and shaking her head, he 'cluded to let her stay on the plantation and nuss the little nigger chilluns when they mammies was to work in the cotton field. The new kitchen Mars Marrabo built wasn't much use, for it hadn't been put up long before the niggers 'mence to notice queer things about it. They could hear something moaning and groaning about in the kitchen in the night time, and when the wind would blow, they could hear something a-hollering and squeaking like it was in great pain and suffering. And it got so after a while that it was all Mars Marrable's wife could do to get a woman to stay in the kitchen in the daytime long enough to do the cooking. And there wasn't nary nigger on the plantation what wouldn't rudder take 40 than to go about that kitchen after dark. That is, 'ceptin' Tenny. She didn't 'pear to mind the ha'nts. She used to slip round at night and set on the kitchen steps and lean up against the door jamb and run on to herself with some kind of foolishness what nobody couldn't make out, for Mars Marrable had threatened to send her off in the plantation if she say anything to any of the other niggers about the pine tree. But somehow or other the niggers found out all about it, and they all knowed the kitchen was haunted by Sandy's spirit. And by it got so Mars Marrable's wife herself was scared to go out in the yard after dark. When it come to that, Mars Marrable took and tore the kitchen down, and used the lumber for to build that old schoolhouse what you were talking about pulling down. The schoolhouse was in use 'ceptin' in the daytime, and on dark nights folks going along the road would hear queer sounds and see queer things. Po' old Tenny used to go down there at night and wander around the schoolhouse, and the niggers all 'lowed she went for to talk with Sandy's spirit. In one winter morning, when one of the boys went to school early for to start the fire, what should he find but po' old Tenny laying on the floor, stiff and cold and dead. There didn't 'pear to be nuffin particular the matter with her. She had just grieved herself to death for her Sandy. Mars Marrable didn't shed no tears. He thought Tenny was crazy, and they wasn't no telling what she might do next. And there ain't much room in this world for crazy white folks, let alone a crazy nigger. It wasn't long after that before Mars Marrable sold a piece of his tract of land to Mars Dougal McAdoo, my old master, and that's how the old schoolhouse happened to be on your place. When the war broke out, the school stopped, and the old schoolhouse been standing empty ever since. That is, 'ceptin' for the ha'nts. And folks says that the old schoolhouse, or any other house what got any of that lumber in it what was sawed out in the tree what Sandy was turned into, is going to be haunted till the last piece of plank is rotted and crumbled into dust. Annie had listened to this gruesome narrative with strained attention. What a system it was, she exclaimed, when Julius had finished, under which such things were possible. What things? I asked in amazement. Are you seriously considering the possibility of a man's being turned into a tree? Oh, no, she replied quickly. Not that. And then she murmured absently, and with a dim look in her fine eyes, Poor Tenny. We ordered the lumber and returned home. That night, after we had gone to bed, and my wife had to all appearances been sound asleep for half an hour, she startled me out of an incipient doze by exclaiming suddenly, "John, I don't believe I want my new kitchen built out of the lumber in that old schoolhouse." "You wouldn't for a moment allow yourself," I replied with some asperity, "to be influenced by that absurdly impossible yarn which Julius was spinning today." "I know the story is absurd," she replied dreamily, "and I am not so silly as to believe it. But I don't think I should ever be able to take any pleasure in that kitchen if it were built out of that lumber. Besides, I think the kitchen would look better and last longer if the lumber were all new." Of course, she had her way. I bought the new lumber, though not without grumbling. A week or two later I was called away from home on business. On my return, after an absence of several days, my wife remarked to me, "John, there has been a split in the Sandy Run Colored Baptist Church on the temperance question. About half the members have come out from the main body, and set up for themselves. Uncle Julius is one of the seceders, and he came to me yesterday and asked if they might not hold their meetings in the old schoolhouse for the present." "I hope you didn't let the old rascal have it," I returned with some warmth. I had just received a bill for the new lumber I had bought. "Well," she replied, "I couldn't refuse him the use of the house for so good a purpose." "And I'll venture to say," I continued, "that you subscribe something toward the support of the new church?" She did not attempt to deny it. "What are they going to do about the ghost?" I asked, somewhat curious to know how Julius would get around this obstacle. "Oh," replied Annie, "Uncle Julius says that ghosts never disturb religious worship, but that if Sandy's spirit should happen to stray into meeting by mistake, no doubt the preaching would do it good." End of Post Sandy. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 3 of The Conjure Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. Section 3 of The Conjure Woman by Charles Waddell CHESNUTT. Ma's Jeems' Nightmare. We found old Julius very useful when we moved to our new residence. He had a thorough knowledge of the neighborhood, was familiar with the roads and the watercourses, knew the qualities of the various soils and what they would produce, and where the best hunting and fishing were to be had. He was a marvelous hand in the management of horses and dogs, with whose mental processes he manifested a greater familiarity than mere use would seem to account for, though it was doubtless due to the simplicity of a life that had kept him close to nature. Toward my tract of land and the things that were on it, the creeks, the swamps, the hills, the meadows, the stones, the trees, he maintained a peculiar personal attitude that might be called predial rather than proprietary. He had been accustomed, until long after middle life, to look upon himself as the property of another. When this relation was no longer possible, owing to the war and to his master's death and the dispersion of the family, he had been unable to break off entirely the mental habits of a lifetime, but had attached himself to the old plantation, of which he seemed to consider himself an appurtenance. We found him useful in many ways and entertaining in others, and my wife and I took quite a fancy to him. Shortly after we became established in our home on the Sandhills, Julius brought up to the house one day a colored boy of about 17, whom he introduced as his grandson, and for whom he solicited employment. I was not favorably impressed by the youth's appearance, quite the contrary, in fact. But mainly to please the old man I hired Tom, his name was Tom, to help about the stables, weed the garden, cut wood and bring water, and in general to make himself useful about the outdoor work of the household. My first impression of Tom proved to be correct. He turned out to be very trifling, and I was much annoyed by his laziness, his carelessness, and his apparent lack of any sense of responsibility. I kept him longer than I should, on Julius's account, hoping that he might improve, but he seemed to grow worse instead of better, and when I finally reached the limit of my patience, I discharged him. "I am sorry, Julius," I said to the old man. "I should have liked to oblige you by keeping him, but I can't stand Tom any longer. He is absolutely untrustworthy." "Yes, sir," replied Julius with a deep sigh and a long shake of the head. "I knows he ain't much account, and dey ain't much dependence to be put on him, but I was hoping dat you might make some allowance for a ignorant young nigger, sir, and give him one more chance." But I had hardened my heart. I had always been too easily imposed upon, and had suffered too much from this weakness. I determined to be firm as a rock in this instance. "No, Julius," I rejoined decidedly, "it is impossible. I gave him more than a fair trial, and he simply won't do." When my wife and I set out for our drive in the cool of the evening (afternoon is evening in Southern parlance), one of the servants put into the rockaway 2 large earthenware jugs. Our drive was to be down through the swamp, to the mineral spring at the foot of the sandhills beyond. The water of this spring was strongly impregnated with sulphur and iron, and, while not particularly agreeable of smell or taste, was used by us in moderation for sanitary reasons. When we reached the spring we found a man engaged in cleaning it out. In answer to an inquiry, he said that if we would wait 5 or 10 minutes, his task would be finished, and the spring in such condition that we could fill our jugs. We might have driven on and come back by way of the spring, but there was a bad stretch of road beyond, and we concluded to remain where we were until the spring should be ready. We were in a cool and shady place. It was often necessary to wait a while in North Carolina, and our northern energy had not been entirely proof against the influences of climate and local custom. While we sat there, a man came suddenly around a turn of the road ahead of us. I recognized in him a neighbor with whom I had exchanged formal calls. He was driving a horse, apparently a high-spirited creature, possessing, so far as I could see at a glance, the marks of good temper and good breeding. The gentleman, I had heard it suggested, was slightly deficient in both. The horse was rearing and plunging, and the man was beating him furiously with a buggy whip. When he saw us, he flushed a fiery red, and as he passed, held the reins with one hand, at some risk to his safety, lifted his hat, and bowed somewhat constrainedly as the horse darted by us, still panting and snorting with fear. "He looks as though he were ashamed of himself," I observed. "I'm sure he ought to be," exclaimed my wife indignantly. "I think there is no worse sin, and no more disgraceful thing than cruelty." "I quite agree with you," I assented. "A man what 'buses his hoss is gwine to be hard on the folks what works for him," remarked Julius. "If young Mr. McLean don't mind, he'll have a bad dream one dese yer days, just like his granddaddy had way back yonder, long years before the war." "What was it about Mr. McLean's dream, Julius?" I asked. The man had not yet finished cleaning the spring, and we might as well put in time listening to Julius as in any other way. We had found some of his plantation tales quite interesting. "Mars Jeems McLean," said Julius, "was de granddaddy of dis here gentleman w'at is jes' gone by us beatin' his hoss. He had a big plantation and a heap of niggers. Mars Jeems was a hard man, and monstrous strict wid his hands. Eber sence he growed up, he neber 'peared to have no feelin' for nobody. When his daddy, ole Mars John McLean, died, de plantation and all de niggers fell to young Mars Jeems. He had been bad enough befo', but it wa'n't long afterwards till it got so dey was no use in livin' at all ef you had ter lib roun' Mars Jeems. His niggers was bleedzd to slave from daylight to dark, w'iles the other folks didn't have to work 'ceptin' from sun to sun. And dey didn't git no mo' to eat dan dey oughter, and dat de coarsest kind. Dey wa'n't 'lowed to sing, ner dance, ner play de banjo w'en Mars Jeems was roun' de place, for Mars Jeems say he wouldn't have no such gwines on. Said he bought his hands to work, and not to play. And when night come, dey must sleep and res', so dey'd be ready to git up soon in de mornin', and go to work fresh and strong. Mars Jeems didn't 'low no courtin' or junesin' roun' his plantation. Said he wanted his niggers to put dey minds on dey work, and not be wastin' dey time wid no such foolishness. And he wouldn't let his hands get mad. Said he wa'n't raisin' niggers, but was raisin' cotton. And wheneber any er de boys and gals had 'mence to get sweet on one anudder, he'd sell one er de udder of 'em, or send 'em way down in Robeson County to his udder plantation, where dey couldn't neber see one anudder. Ef any er de niggers eber complained, dey got 40, so co'se dey didn't many of 'em complain. But dey didn't like it, jest the same, and nobody couldn't blame 'em, for dey had a hard time. Mars Jeems didn't make no 'lowance fer nat'ral bawn laziness, ner sickness, ner trouble in de mind, ner nuffin. He was jes' gwine git so much work out er eve'y han', or know de reason why. Dey was one time de niggers 'lowed fer a spell dat Mars Jeems might git better. He tuk a likin' ter Mars Marrabo McSwain's oldest gal, Miss Libbie, and used to go over there every day or every evening, and folks said they was going to get married, sure. But it appears that Miss Libby heard about the goings-on Mars Jeems' plantation, and she just 'lowed she couldn't trust herself with no such a man, that he might get so used to abusing his niggers that he'd meant to abuse his wife after he got used to having her around the house. So she declared she wasn't going to have nothing more to do with young Mars Jeems. The niggers was all monstrous sorry when the match was bust up, for now Mars Jeems got worse than he was before he started sweethearting. The time he used to spend courting Miss Libby, he put in finding fault with the niggers, and all his bad feelings 'cause Miss Libby throwed him over, he appeared to try to work off on the poor niggers. Whilst Mars Jeems was courting Miss Libby, two of the hands on the plantation had got to setting a heap of store by one another. One of 'em was named Solomon, and the other was a woman what worked in the field longer'n I am. I forget that woman's name, but it don't 'mount to much in the tale nohow. Now, whether 'cause Mars Jeems was so tuck up with his own Junesy, sweetheart, that it didn't pay no attention for a while to what was going on 'twixt Solomon and his Junesy, or whether his own courting made him kind of easy on the courting in the quarters, there ain't no telling. But there's one thing sure, that when Miss Libby throwed him over, he found out about Solomon and the gal monstrous quick, and gunned Solomon 40, and sent the gal down to the Robeson County plantation and told all the niggers if he catch him at any more such foolishness, he was going to skin 'em alive and tan their hides before their very eyes. 'Course he wouldn't have done it, but it might have made things worse than they was. So you can imagine they wasn't much love-making in the quarters for a long time. Mars Jeems used to go down to the other plantations sometimes for a week or more, and so he had to hire an overseer to look after his work while he's gone. Mars Jeems' overseer was a poor white man named Nick Johnson. The niggers called him Mars Johnson to his face, but behind his back they used to call him Old Nick, and the name suited him to a T. He was worse than Mars Jeems ever dared to be. 'Course the darkies didn't like the way Mars Jeems used him, but he was the master, and had a right to do as he pleased. But this here Old Nick wasn't nothing but a po' buckra, and all the niggers spies him as much as they hated him, but he didn't own nobody, and wasn't no better than a nigger, for in them days any 'spectable person would rather be a nigger than a po' white man. Now after Solomon's gal had been sent away, he kept feeling mo' and mo' bad about it, till finally he 'lowed he was going to see if they couldn't be something done for to get her back, and to make Mars Jeems treat the darkies better. So he took a peck of cotton out the barn one night and went over to see old Aunt Peggy, the free nigger Cajun woman down by the Wilmington Road. Aunt Peggy listened to his tale and asked him some questions, and then told him she would work her roots and see what they'd say about it, and tomorrow night he should come back again and fetch another peck of corn, and then she'd have something for to tell him. So Solomon went back the next night, and sure enough Aunt Peggy told him what to do. She gun him some stuff what looked like it had been made by pounding up some roots and yerbs with a pestle and a mortar. "This here stuff," says she, "is monstrous powerful kind of goofer. You take this home and gin it to the cook, if you can trust her, and tell her for to put it in your master's soup the first cloudy day he have okra soup for dinner. Mind you follow the directions. It ain't going to poison him, is it?" Solomon getting kind of scared, for Solomon was a good man, didn't want to do nobody no real harm. "Oh, no," says old Aunt Peggy, "it's going to do him good, but he'll have a monstrous bad dream first. A month from now you come down here and let me know how the goofer is working, for I ain't done much of this kind of conjuring of late years, and I has to kind of keep track on it to see that it don't accomplish no more than I allows for it to do. And I has to be kind of careful about conjuring white folks, so be sure and let me know whatever you do, just what is going on around the plantation." So Solomon say all right, and took the goofer mixture up to the big house, and gun it to the cook, and told her for to put it in Mars Jeems' soup the first cloudy day she have okra soup for dinner. It happened that the very next day was a cloudy day, and so the cook made okra soup for Mars Jeems' dinner, and put the powder Solomon gunner into the soup, and made the soup real good, so Mars Jeems did a whole lot of it and 'peared to enjoy it. The next morning, Mars Jeems told the overseer he was going away on some business, and then he was going to his other plantation down in Robeson County, and he didn't expect he'd be back for a month or so. "But," says he, "I want you to run this here plantation for all it's worth. These here niggers is getting monstrous trifling and lazy and careless, and they ain't no dependence to be put in 'em. I wants that stop. And whiles I'm going away, I wants the expenses cut way down and a heap more work done. Fact, I want this here plantation to make a record that'll show what kind of overseer you is." Old Nick didn't say nothing but "Yes, sir." But the way he kind of grinned to himself and show his big yellow teeth and snapped a rawhide he used to carry around with him made cold chills run up and down the backbone of them niggers what heard Mars Jeems a talking. And that night they was moaning and groaning down in the quarters, for the niggers all know what was coming. So, sure enough, Mars Jeems went away next morning, and the trouble begun. Mars Johnson started off the very first day for to see what he could have to show Mars Jeems when he come back. He made the task bigger and the rations littler, and when the niggers had worked all day, he'd find something for to do round the barn or somewheres after dark, for to keep 'em busy an hour or so before they went to sleep. About 3 or 4 days after Mars Jeems went away, young Mars Duncan McSwain rode up to the big house one day with a nigger sitting behind him in the buggy, tied to the seat, and asked if Mars Jeems was home. Mars Johnson was at the house, and he say no. "Well," says Mars Duncan, says he, "I fotched this nigger over to Mr. McLean for to pay a bet I made with him last week when we was playing cards together. I bet him a nigger man, and here's one I reckon'll fill the bill. He was took up the other day for a stray nigger, and he couldn't give no count of hisself, and so he was sold at auction, and I bought him. He's kind of brash, but I knows your powers, Mr. Johnson, and I reckon if anybody can make him toe the mark, you is the man." Mars Johnson grinned one of them grins which show all his snagger teeth, and make the niggers 'low he looked like the old Deborah, and says he to Mars Duncan, "I reckon you can trust me, Mr. Duncan, for to tame any nigger was ever born. The nigger don't live what I can't take down in 'bout 4 days." Well, old Nick had his hands full longer that new nigger, and whiles the rest of the darkies was sorry for the po' man, they 'lowed he kept Mars Johnson so busy that they got along better than they'd 'a' done if the new nigger had never come. The first thing that happened, Mars Johnson says to this yer new man, "What's your name, Sambo?" "My name ain't Sambo," spoke the new nigger. "Did I ax you what your name wasn't?" says Mars Johnson. "You wants to be particular how you talks to me. Now what is your name, and where did you come from?" "I don't know my name," says the nigger, "and I don't remember where I come from. My head is all kind of mixed up." "Yes," says Mars Johnson, "I reckon I'll have to give you something for to clear your head. At the same time it'll learn you some manners, and after this maybe you'll say 'sir' when you speaks to me." Well, Mars Johnson haul off with his rawhide and hit the new nigger once. The new man looked at Mars Johnson for a minute as if he didn't know what to make of this here kind of learning. But when the overseer raised his whip to hit him again, the new nigger just haul off and made for Massa Johnson, and if some of the other niggers hadn't stopped him, it appears as if it might have made it warm for old Nick there for a while. But the overseer made the other niggers help tie the new nigger up, and then gun him 40, with a dozen or so throwed in for good measure, for old Nick was never stingy with them kind of rations. The nigger went on at a terrible rate, just like a wild man, but 'cause he was bleezed to take his medicine, for he was tied up and couldn't help himself. Massa Johnson locked the new nigger up in the barn, and didn't give him nuffin to eat for a day or so, till he got him kind of quiet down. Then he turned him loose and put him to work. The nigger 'lowed he wasn't used to working, and wouldn't work, and Mars Johnson gun him another 40 for laziness and impotence, and let him fast a day or so more, and then put him to work again. The nigger went to work, but didn't 'pear to know how to handle a hoe. It took just about half the overseer's time looking after him, and that po' nigger got more lashings and cussings and cuffings than any 4 others on the plantation. He didn't mix with nor talk much to the rest of the niggers, and couldn't 'pear to get through his mind that he was a slave and had to work and mind the white folks, spite of the fact that old Nick gun him a lesson every day. And finally, Mars Johnson 'lowed that he couldn't do nothing with him, that if he was his nigger, he'd break his spirit or break his neck, one or the other. But 'course he was only sot over on trial, and as he didn't give satisfaction, and he hadn't heard from Mars Jeems 'bout when he was coming back, and as he was feared he'd get mad some time or nother and kill a nigger before he knowed it, he 'lowed he'd better send him back where he come from. So he tied him up and sot him back to Mars Duncan. Now, Mars Duncan McSwain was one of these here easy-going gentlemen what didn't like to hate no trouble with niggers or nobody else, and he knowed if Mars old Nick couldn't get along with his nigger, nobody could. So he took the nigger to town that same day and sold him to a trader what was getting up a gang of likely niggers for to ship off on the steamboat to go down the river to Wimbledon, and from there to New Orleans. The next day, after the new man had been sent away, Solomon was working in the cotton field, and when he got to the fence next to the woods, at the end of the row, who should he see on the other side but old Aunt Peggy. She beckoned to him, the overseer was down on the other side of the field, and says she, "Why ain't you done come and ported to me like I told you?" "Why, law, Aunt Peggy," says Solomon, "dey ain't nuffin to port. Mars Jeems went away day after we gun him the goofer mixtry, and we ain't seen hide nor hair of him since. And course we don't know nuffin 'bout what 'fect you had on him. I don't care nuffin 'bout yo' Mars Jeems now. What I wants to know is what has been going on 'mongst the niggers. Has you been getting along any better on the plantation?" "No, Aunt Peggy, we been getting along wusser. Mars Johnson is stricter'n he eber was befo', and the po' niggers don't hardly get time to draw dey breath, and dey 'lows dey might jes' as well be dead as alive." "Uh-huh," says Aunt Peggy, says she. "I tole you dat is monst'us powerful goofer, and its work don't 'pear all at once. Long as we had dat new nigger here," Solomon went on, "he kep' Mars Johnson busy part de time, but now he's gone away, I s'pose the rest on us'll ketch it wusser'n eber." "What's gone wid de new nigger?" says Aunt Peggy, rale quick, batting her eyes and straightening up. "Ole Nick done sont him back to Mars Duncan, who had fotch him here fer to pay a gamblin' debt to Mars Jeems," says Solomon. "And I hear Mars Duncan has sold him to a nigger trader up in Patesville, what's gwine to ship him off wid a gang tomorrow." Ole Aunt Peggy 'peared to get rale stirred up when Solomon told her dat, and says she, shaking her stick at him, "Why didn't you come and tell me 'bout dis new nigger bein' sold away? Didn't you promise me ef I give you dat goofer, you'd come and 'pote to me 'bout all what's gwine on dis plantation? Course I could 'a' found out fer myself, but I 'pended on you tellin' me, and now by not doin' it I's feared you gwine spoil my conjurin'. You come down to my house ter night and do what I tells you, or I'll put a spell on you dat'll make yo' hair fall out so you'll be bald, and yo' eyes drap out so you can't see, and yo' teeth fall out so you can't eat, and yo' years grow up so you can't hear. When you is foolin' wid a conjure woman like me, you gotter mind yo' P's and Q's, or dere'll be trouble sho' 'nuff." So, co'se, Solomon went down to Aunt Peggy's dat night, and she got him a roasted sweet'n' tater. "You take dis here sweet'n' tater," says she. "I done goofed it specially fer dat nigger, so you bet not eat it yo'self or you'll wish you hadn't. And slip off to town and find dat strange man and give him dis here sweet'n' tater. He must eat it befo' mornin' sho', ef he don't want to be sold away to New Orleans." "But s'posen the patty rollers ketch me, Aunt Peggy, what I gwine to do?" says Solomon. "De patty rollers ain't gwine to tech you, but ef you don't find dat nigger I'm gwine to git you, and you'll find me wusser'n de patty rollers. Jes' hol' on a minute, and I'll sprinkle you with some of this mixture out in this yer bottle, so the patter rollers can't see you. And you can rub your feet with some of this here grease out in this gourd, so you can run fast, and rub some of it in your eyes so you can see in the dark. And then you must find that new nigger and give him this here tater, or you're going to have more trouble on your hands than you ever had before in your life, or ever will have since." So Solomon took the sweetened tater and started up the road fast as he could go, and before long he reached town. He went right along by the patter rollers, and they didn't 'pear to notice him. And by he found where the strange nigger was kept, and he walked right past the guard at the door and found him. The nigger couldn't see him, of course, and he couldn't have seen the nigger in the dark if it hadn't been for the stuff Aunt Peggy gun him to rub on his eyes. The nigger was laying in a cornder, asleep, and Solomon just slip up to him and hit that sweetened tater for the nigger's nose. And he just naturally retch up with his hand and took the tater and eat it in his sleep without knowing it. When Solomon seed he done eat the tater, he went back and told Aunt Peggy, and then went home to his cabin to sleep, way along about 2 o'clock in the morning. The next day was Sunday, and so the niggers had a little time to themselves. Solomon was kind of stirred in his mind thinking about his Junesy what is going away, and wondering what Aunt Peggy had to do with that new nigger, and he had sauntered up in the woods so's to be by himself a little, and at the same time to look at the rabbit trap he'd sot down in the edge of the swamp, when who should he see standing under a tree but a white man. Solomon didn't know the white man at first, till the white man spoke up to him. "Is that you, Solomon?" says he. Then Solomon recognized the voice. "For the law's sake, Marster Jeems, is that you?" "Yes, Solomon," says his master, "this is me, or what's left of me." It wasn't no wonder Solomon hadn't known Mars Jeems at first, for he was dressed like a po' white man, and was barefooted and looked monstrous pale and peaked, as if he'd just come through a hard spell of sickness. "You were looking kind of po'ly, Mars Jeems," says Solomon. "Is you been sick, suh?" "No, Solomon," says Mars Jeems, shaking his head and speaking sort of slow and sad. "I ain't been sick, but I's had a monstrous bad dream. Fact, a regular natural nightmare. But tell me how things has been going up to the plantation since I been gone, Solomon." So Solomon up and told him about the crops, and about the horses and the mules, and about the cows and the hogs, and when he meant to tell him about the new nigger, Mars Jeems prick up his ears and listen, and every now and then he say, "Uh-huh, mm-huh," and nod his head, and by, when he'd ask Solomon some more questions, he says he, "Now, Solomon, I don't want you to say a word to nobody about meeting me here, but I want you to slip up to the house and fetch me some clothes and some shoes. I forgot to tell you that a man robbed me back yonder on the road and swapped clothes with me without asking me whether or no. But you needn't to say nothing about that nuther. You go and fetch me some clothes here, so nobody won't see you, and keep your mouth shut, and I'll give you $1. Solomon was so 'stonished he like to fell over in his tracks when Mars Jeems promised to give him $1. They certainly was a change come over Mars Jeems when he offered one of his niggers that much money. Solomon meant to suspect that Aunt Peggy's conjation had been working monstrous strong. Solomon fotched Mars Jeems some clothes and shoes, and that same evening Mars Jeems 'peared at the house and let on like he just that minute got home from Robeson County. Mars Johnson was all ready to talk to him, but Mars Jeems sot him word he wa'n't feeling very well that night, and he'd see him tomorrow. So next morning, after breakfast, Mars Jeems sent for the overseer, and asked him for to give count of his stewardship. Old Nick told Mars Jeems how much work been done, and got the books and showed him how much money been saved. Then Mars Jeems asked him how the darkies been behaving, and Mars Johnson say they been behaving good, most of 'em, and them what didn't behave good at first changed their conduct after he got holt of 'em a time or two. "All," says he, "'ceptin' the new nigger Mr. Duncan fotch over here and left on trial while you was gone." "Ah, yes," 'lows Mars Jeems, Tell me all about that new nigger. I heard a little about that queer new nigger last night, and it was just too ridiculous. Tell me all about that new nigger." So, seeing Mars Jeems so good-natured about it, Mars Johnson up and told him how he tied up the new hand the first day and gun him 40 'cause he wouldn't tell him his name. "Ha, ha, ha," says Mars Jeems, laughing fit to kill, "but dat is too funny for any use. Tell me some mo' 'bout dat new nigger." So Mars Johnson went on and told him how he had to starve the new nigger 'fore he could make him take hold of a hoe. "Dat was de beatin'est notion for a nigger," says Mars Jeems, putting on airs just like he was a white man, "and I reckon you didn't do nuffin to him." "Oh, no, suh," says the overseer, grinning like a cheesy cat. "I didn't do nuffin but take de hide off'n him." Mars Jeems laughed and laughed till it 'peared like he was gwine to bust. "Tell me some mo' 'bout dat new nigger. Oh, tell me some mo'. Dat new nigger interests me, he do, and dat is a fac'." Mars Johnson didn't quite understand why Mars Jeems should make such a great narration 'bout the new nigger, but course he want to please the gentleman would hide him, and so he 'plained all about how many times he had to cowhide the new nigger, and how he made him do tasks twice as big as some of the other hands, and how he'd chain him up in the barn at night and feed him on cornbread and water. "Oh, but you was a monstrous good overseer. You was de best overseer in dis county, Mr. Johnson," says Mars Jeems, when the overseer got th'ough with his tale, "and dey ain't neber been no nigger breaker like you roun' here befo'. And you deserves great credit for sending that nigger away before you spilt him for the market. Fact, you was such a monstrous good overseer, and you has got dis here plantation in such fine shape that I reckon I don't need you no mo'. You has got dese here darkies so well trained dat I 'spec I kin run 'em myself from dis time on. But I does wish you had a hilt on to dat new nigger till I got home, for I'd 'a' liked to seed him, I certainly should." The overseer was so 'stonished he didn't hardly know what to say, but finally he asked Mars Jeems if he wouldn't give him a recommend fer to git him another place. "No, suh," says Mars Jeems. "Somehow or 'nother I don't like yo' looks sence I come back dis time, and I'd much ruther you wouldn't stay roun' here. Fac', I's feared if I'd meet you alone in the woods sometime I mought want to harm you. But layin' dat aside, I been lookin' over dese here books of yourn w'at you kep' while I was away, and fer a year or so back, and dere's some figgers w'at ain't jes' clear to me. I ain't got no time fer to talk about 'em now, but I 'spec befo' I settles wid you fer dis las' month, you better come up here termorrer atter I's looked the books and counts over some mo', and den we'll straighten our business all up." Mars Jeems 'lowed atterwards dat he was jes' shootin' in de dark w'en he said dat 'bout de books, but howsomeber, Mars Nick Johnson lep dat neighborhood 'twixt de nex' 2 suns, and nobody roun' here neber seed hidin' a hair of 'em sence. And all the darkies thanked the Lawd and 'lowed it was a good riddance of bad rubbage. But all dem things I done tol' you ain't nuffin 'cidin' de change w'at come over Mars Jeems from dat time on. Aun Peggy's goopher had made a new man of him entirely. De nex' day atter he come back, he tol' de hands dey needn't ter work only from sun to sun, and he cut dey tasks down so dey didn't nobody have ter stan' over 'em wid a rawhide or a hickory. And he 'lowed if de niggers want to hab a dance in de big barn any Saturday night, dey mought hab it. And bimeby, w'en Solomon seed how good Mars Jeems was, he ax' him ef he wouldn't please sen' down ter de other plantation fer his junesey. Mars Jeems say suttinly, and gun Solomon a pass and a note to de overseer on de other plantation, and sont Solomon down to Robeson County wid a hoss and buggy fer ter fetch his junesey back. W'en de niggers see how fine Mars Jeems gwine treat 'em, dey all tuk to sweetheartin' and juneseying and singin' and dancin', and 8 or 10 couples got married, and bimeby everybody 'mence ter say Mars Jeems McLean got a finer plantation and slicker lookin' niggers, and dat he is makin' mo' cotton and corn dan any other gentleman in de county. And Mars Jeems' own junesey, Miss Libby, heard 'bout de new gwines on Mars Jeems' plantation, and she changed her mind 'bout Mars Jeems and tuk him back agin, and 'fo' long dey had a fine weddin', and all de darkies had a big feas', and they was fiddling and dancing and funning and frolicking from sundown to morning." "And they all lived happy ever after," I said as the old man reached a full stop. "Yes, suh," he said, interpreting my remarks as a question. "They did. Solomon used to say," he added, "that Aun Peggy's goopher had turnt Mars Jeems to a nigger, and dat new hen was Mars Jeems hisse'f. But 'cause Solomon didn't dast ter let on 'bout w'at he 'spicioned, and ole Aun Peggy would 'a' 'nied it ef she had be'n axed, fer she'd 'a' got in trouble sho' ef it 'uz knowed she'd be'n conjurin' de w'ite folks. Dis yer tale goes ter show," concluded Julius sententiously, as the man came up and announced that the spring was ready for us to get water, "dat w'ite folks w'at is so hard en stric' en don't make no 'lowance fer po' ign'ant niggers w'at ain' had no chance ter l'arn is liable ter have bad dreams, ter say de leas', en dat dem w'at is kin' en good ter po' people is sho' ter prosper en git 'long in de worl'." "That is a very strange story, Uncle Julius," observed my wife, smiling, "and Solomon's explanation is quite improbable." "Yes, Julius," said I, "that was powerful goopher. I am glad, too, that you told us the moral of the story. It might have escaped us otherwise. By the way, did you make that up all by yourself?" The old man's face assumed an injured look, expressive more of sorrow than of anger, and shaking his head, he replied, "No, suh. I heared dat tale befo' you er Miss Annie dere was bawn, suh. My mammy tole me dat tale w'en I wa'n't mo' d'n knee high to a hoppergrass." I drove to town next morning on some business, and did not return until noon, and after dinner I had to visit a neighbor, and did not get back until supper time. I was smoking a cigar on the back piazza in the early evening, when I saw a familiar figure carrying a bucket of water to the barn. I called my wife. "My dear," I said severely, "what is that rascal doing here? I thought I discharged him yesterday for good and all." "Oh yes," she answered, "I forgot to tell you. He was hanging round the place all the morning, and looking so down in the mouth, that I told him that if he would try to do better, we would give him one more chance. He seemed so grateful and so really in earnest in his promises of amendment, that I'm sure you'll not regret taking him back." I was seriously enough annoyed to let my cigar go out. I did not share my wife's rose colored hopes in regard to Tom, but as I did not wish the servants to think there was any conflict of authority in the household, I let the boy stay. End of Mars Jeems' Nightmare. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 4 of the Conjure Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. Section 4 of The Conjure Woman by Charles Waddell CHESNUTT. The Conjurer's Revenge. Sunday was sometimes a rather dull day at our place. In the morning, when the weather was pleasant, my wife and I would drive to town, a distance of about 5 miles, to attend the church of our choice. The afternoons we spent at home, for the most part occupying ourselves with the newspapers and magazines, and the contents of a fairly good library. We had a piano in the house, on which my wife played with skill and feeling. I possessed a passable baritone voice, and could accompany myself indifferently well when my wife was not by to assist me. When these resources failed us, we were apt to find it a little dull. One Sunday afternoon in early spring, the balmy spring of North Carolina, when the air is in that ideal balance between heat and cold where one wishes it could always remain, my wife and I were seated on the front piazza, she wearily but conscientiously plowing through a missionary report, while I followed the impossible career of the blonde heroine of a rudimentary novel. I had thrown the book aside in disgust, when I saw Julius coming through the yard, under the spreading elms which were already in full leaf. He wore his Sunday clothes, and advanced with a dignity of movement quite different from his week-day slouch. "Have a seat, Julius," I said, pointing to an empty rocking chair. "No, thank you, boss. I'll just sit here on the top step." "Oh, no, Uncle Julius," exclaimed Annie. "Take this chair. You will find it much more comfortable." The old man grinned in appreciation of her solicitude, and seated himself somewhat awkwardly. "Julius," I remarked, "I am thinking of setting out scuppernong vines on that sandhill where the 3 persimmon trees are. And while I'm working there, I think I'll plant watermelons between the vines, and get a little something to pay for my first year's work. The new railroad will be finished by the middle of summer, and I can ship the melons north, and get a good price for them." "If you're going to have any more plowing to do," replied Julius, "I 'spect you'll have to buy another creature, 'cause it's much as them horses can do to 'tend to the work they got now." "Yes, I had thought of that. I think I'll get a mule. A mule can do more work, and doesn't require as much attention as a horse." "I wouldn't advise you to buy no mule," remarked Julius, with a shake of his head. "Why not?" "Well, you may 'low it's all foolishness, but if I was in yo' place, I wouldn't buy no mule." "But that isn't a reason. What objection have you to a mule?" "Fac' is," continued the old man in a serious tone, "I don't like to drive a mule. I's allers feared I might be imposin' on some human creature. Every time I cuts a mule wid a hickory, 'pears to me most lackly I's cuttin' some of my own relations, somebody else what can't help theirselves." "What put such an absurd idea into your head?" I asked. My question was followed by a short silence, during which Julius seemed engaged in a mental struggle. "I don't know as it's wuth while to tell you dis," he said at length. "I don't hardly 'spect fer you to believe it. Does you 'member dat club-footed man w'at helt de horse fer you de other day, w'en you was gittin' out er de rockaway down to Mars Archie McMillan's sto'?" "Yes, I believe I do remember seeing a club-footed man there." "Did you eber see a club-footed nigger befo' or sence?" "No, I can't remember that I ever saw a club-footed colored man," I replied after a moment's reflection. "You and Miss Annie wouldn't want to beliebe me ef I was to 'low dat dat man was oncet a mule." "No," I replied, "I don't think it very likely that you could make us believe it." "Why, Uncle Julius," said Annie severely, "what ridiculous nonsense!" This reception of the old man's statement reduced him to silence, and it required some diplomacy on my part to induce him to vouchsafe an explanation. The prospect of a long, dull afternoon was not alluring, and I was glad to have the monotony of Sabbath quite relieved by a plantation legend. "When I was a young man," began Julius, when I had finally prevailed upon him to tell us the story, "dat club-footed nigger, his name is Primus, used to belong to ole Mars Jim McGee ober on de Lumberton Plank Road. I used to go ober dere to see a woman w'at libbed on de plantation. Dat's how I come to know all about it. Dis yer Primus wuz de liveliest han' on de place, alluz a dancin' en drinkin' en runnin' roun' en singin' en pickin' de banjo. 'Cep'n once in a w'ile, w'en he'd 'low he wa'n't treated right 'bout somethin' er nudder, he'd git so sulky en stubborn dat de w'ite folks couldn't hardly do nuffin wid him. It wuz 'gin de rules fer any er de hands to go 'way fum de plantation at night, but Primus didn' min' de rules, en went w'en he felt lack it. En de w'ite folks p'ten' lack dey didn' know it, fer Primus wuz dangerous w'en he got in dem stubborn spells, en dey'd ruther not fool wid him. One night, in de spring er de year, Primus slip' off from de plantation en went down on de Wim'l'ton Road to a dance gun by some er de free niggers down dere. Dey wuz a fiddle en a banjo en a jug gwine roun' on de outside, en Primus sung en danced till long 'bout 2 o'clock in de mawnin'. when he started for home. As he come along back, he took a nigh cut 'cross the cotton fields and long by the edge of the mineral spring swamp, so as to get shut of the patter rollers would rid up and down the big road for to keep the darkies from running round nights. Primus was sauntering along studying about the good time he'd had with the gals, when as he was gone by a fence corner, what should he hear but something grunt. He stopped a minute to listen, and he heard something grunt again. Then he went over to the fence where he heard the fuss, and there laying in the fence corner, on a pile of pine straw, he seed a fine, fat shoat. Primus looked hard at the shoat, and then started home. But somehow or other he couldn't get away from that shoat. When he took one step forwards with one foot, the other foot appeared to take 2 steps backwards, and so he kept naturally getting closer and closer to the shoat. It was the beatin'est thing. The shoat just appeared to charm Primus, and first thing you know, Primus found himself way up the road with the shoat on his back. If Primus had a knowed whose shoat that was, he'd have managed to get past it somehow or another. As it happened, the shoat belonged to a conjure man what lived down in the free nigger settlement. 'Course, the conjure man didn't have to work his roots but a little while 'fore he found out who took his shoat, and then the trouble begun. One morning, a day or so later, and before he got the shoat eat up, Primus didn't go to work when the horn blow, and when the overseer went to look for him, there wasn't no trace of Primus to be 'scovered nowhere. When he didn't come back in a day or so more, everybody on the plantation 'lowed he'd run away. His master advertised him in the papers and offered a big reward for him. The nigger catchers fotch out the dogs and track him down to the edge of the swamp, and then the scent gun out, and that was the last anybody see of Primus for a long, long time. 2 or 3 weeks after Primus disappeared, his master went to town one Sunday. Mars Jim was standing in front of Sandy Campbell's bar room up by the old wagon yard, when a po' white man from down on the Wilmington Road come up to him and asked him kind of careless like if he didn't want to buy a mule. "I don't know," says Mars Jim. "It depends on the mule, and on the price. Where's the mule?" "Just round here, back of old Tom McAllister's store," says the po' white man. "I reckon I'll have a look at the mule," says Mars Jim, "and if it suit me, I don't know but what I might buy him." So the po' white man took Mars Jim round back of the store, and there stood a monstrous fine mule. When the mule see Mars Jim, he gun a whinny, just like he knowed him before. Mars Jim look at the mule, and the mule 'peared to be sound and strong. Mars Jim 'lowed dey 'peared to be something familiar about the mule's face, 'specially his eyes, but he hadn't lost near a mule, and didn't have no recommembrance of having seen the mule before. He asked the po' buckra where he got the mule, and the po' buckra say his bruh raised the mule down on Rockfish Creek. Mars Jim was a little suspicious of seeing a po' white man with such a fine creature, but he finally agreed to give the man $50 for the mule, about half what a good mule was worth them days. He tied the mule behind the buggy when he went home, and put him to plowing cotton the next day. The mule done mighty well for 3 or 4 days, and then the niggers mens to notice some queer things about him. There was a meadow on the plantation where they used to put the horses and mules to pasture. It was fenced off from the cornfield on one side, but on the other side of the pasture was a tobacco patch where it wasn't fenced off, 'cause the beasteses done none of 'em eat tobacco. They don't know what's good. Tobacco is like religion. The good Lord made it for people, and they ain't no other creature what can 'preciate it. The darkies noticed that the first thing the new mule done, when he was turned into the pasture, was to make for the tobacco patch. 'Course they didn't think nuffin on it, but next morning, when they went to catch him, they discovered that he'd eat up 2 whole rows of tobacco plants. After that, they had to put a halt on him and tie him to a stake, or else they wouldn't have been ne'er a leaf of tobacco left in the patch. Another day, one of the hands, named Dolphus, hitched a mule up and drive up here to the vineyard. That was when old Mars Dugal owned this place. Mars Dugal had killed a yearling, and the neighbor white folks all sont over for to get some fresh meat, and Mars Jim had sont Dolphus for some too. There was a wine press in the yard where Dolphus left a mule standing, and right in front of the press there was a tub of grape juice, just pressed out, and a little to one side a barrel about half full of wine what had been standing 2 or 3 days, and had begun to get sort of sharp to the taste. There was a couple of boards on top of this here barrel with a rock laid on 'em to hold 'em down. As I was saying, Dolphus left a mule standing in the yard and went into the smokehouse for to get the beef. By and by, when he come out, he seed the mule was staggering about the yard, and 'fore Dolphus could get there to find out what was the matter, the mule fell right over on his side and laid there just like he was dead. All the niggers about the house run out there for to see what was the matter. Some say the mule had the colic, some say one thing and some another, till by and by one of the hands seed the top was off of the barrel and run and looked in. "'Fo' the Lord,' he say, 'dat mule drunk, he been drinking the wine.' And sho' nuff the mule had passed right by the tub of fresh grape juice and pushed the cover off in the barrel, and drunk 2 or 3 gallons of the wine what had been standing long enough for to begin to get sharp. The darkies all made a great moration 'bout the mule getting drunk. They never hadn't seen nuffin like it in they born days. They poured water over the mule and tried to sober him up, but it wasn't no use, and Dolphus had to take the beef home on his back and leave the mule there till he slep off his spree. I don't 'member whether I told you or not, but when Primus disappeared from the plantation, he left a wife behind him, a monstrous good-looking yeller gal named Sally. When Primus had been gone a month or so, Sally meant for to get lonesome and took up with another young man named Dan, what belonged on the same plantation. One day this here Dan took the new mule out in the cotton field for to plow, and when they was gone 'long the turn row, who should he meet but this here Sally. Dan looked round and he didn't see the overseer nowhere, so he stopped a minute for to run on with Sally. "Howdy, honey," says he. "How you feelin' this morning?" "First rate," spun Sally. They was looking at one another, and they didn't near one of 'em pay no attention to the mule, who had turned his head round and was looking at Sally as hard as he could, and stretching his neck and raising his ears and whining kind of soft to herself. "Yes, honey," 'lows Dan, "and you gwine to feel first rate long as you sticks to me, for I's a better man than that low-down runaway nigger Primus that you been wasting your time with." Dan had let go the plow hander, and had put his arm round Sally, and was just gwine to kiss her, when something ketch him by the scruff of the neck and flung him way over in the cotton patch. When he picked himself up, Sally had gone kitting down the turn row, and the mule was standing there looking as calm and peaceful as a sunny morning. First, Dan had 'lowed it was the overseer what had cotch him wasting his time, but they wasn't no overseer in sight, so he concluded it must have been the mule. So he pitched into the mule and lammed him as hard as he could. The mule took it all, and 'peared to be as humble as a mule could be. But when they was making the turn at the end of the row, one of the plow lines got under the mule's hind leg. Dan reached down to get the line out, sort of careless like, when the mule haul off and kick him clean over the fence into a briar patch on the other side. Dan was mighty sore from his wounds and scratches, and was laid up for 2 or 3 days. One night the new mule got out in the pasture and went down to the quarters. Dan was laying there on his pallet when he heard something banging away at the side of his cabin. He raised up on one shoulder and looked round, when what should he see but the new mule's head sticking in the window, with his lips drawed back over his toofs, grinning and snapping at Dan just like he wanted to eat him up. Then the mule went round to the door and kicked away like he wanted to break the door down, till by and by somebody come along and drive him back to the pasture. When Sally come in a little later from the big house, where she'd been waiting on the white folks, she found po' Dan nigh about dead, he was so scared. She 'lowed Dan had had a nightmare, but when they look at the door, they seed the marks of the mule's huffs, so they couldn't be no mistake about what had happened. Course the niggers told their master 'bout the mule's goings on. First he didn't pay no 'tention to it, but after a while he told 'em if they didn't stop their foolishness, he gwine tie some of 'em up. So after that they didn't say nuffin mo' to their master, but they kep' on noticing the mule's queer ways just the same. 'Long 'bout de middle of de summer, there was a big camp meetin' broke out down on the Wilmington road, and nigh 'bout all de po' white folks and free niggers in the settlement got 'ligion. And lo and behold, 'mongst 'em was de Conjure man what owned de shote wid Charm Primus. Dis Conjure man was a Guinea nigger, and befo' he was sot free had used to belong to a gentleman down in Sampson County. De Conjure man say his daddy was a king, a governor, or some sort of whatchamacallem, way over yonder in Africa, where the niggers come from, befo' he was stowed away and sold to the speculators. De Conjure man had helped his marster out in some trouble or nuther with his goofer, and his marster had sot him free and bought him a tract of land down on the Wilmington road. He pretend to be a cow doctor, but everybody knowed what he really was. De Conjure man hadn't mowed and come through good before he was took sick with a cold what he cotched kneeling on the ground so long at the mourner's bench. It kept getting worser and worser, and by the rheumatiz took holt of him and drawed 'em all up, till one day he sent word up to Mars Jim McGee's plantation, and ax Pete, the nigger what took care of the mules, for to come down there that night and fetch that mule what his master had bought from the po' white man during the summer. Pete didn't know what the Conjure man was driving at, but he didn't dast to stay away, and so that night, when he'd done eat his bacon and his hoe cake and drunk his molasses and water, he put a bridle on the mule and rid him down to the Conjure man's cabin. When he got to the door, he lit and hitched the mule, and then knocks at the door. It felt mighty jubous about going in, but he was obleeged to do it. He knowed he couldn't help hisself. "Pull the string," says a weak voice, and when Pete lifted the latch and went in, the Conjure man was laying on the bed, looking pale and weak, like he didn't have much longer for to live. "Is you fotch de mule?" says he. Pete say yes, and the Conjure man kep' on. "Brer Pete," says he, "I's been a monstrous sinner, man, and I's done a pile of wickedness in doing it in my days. But the good Lord has washed my sins away, and I feels now that I's bound for the kingdom. And I feels, too, that I ain't going to get up from this bed no more in this world, and I wants to undo some of the harm I done. And that's the reason, Brer Pete, I sent for you to fetch that mule down here. You 'member that shote I was up to your plantation quiet about last June?" "Yas," says Brer Pete. "I 'member yo' axin' 'bout a shote you had los'." "I don't know whether you ever learned it or no," says the Conjure man, "but I done knowed your master's Primus had took the shote, and I was bound to get even with him. So one night I cotch him down by the swamp on his way to a candy pullin', and I throwed a goopher mixture on him and turned him to a mule, and got a po' white man to sell the mule, and we divided the money. But I don't want to die till I turn Brer Primus back again." Then the Conjure man asked Pete to take down 1 or 2 gourds off in the shelf in the corner and 1 or 2 bottles with some kind of mixture in 'em, and set 'em on a stool by the bed, and then he asked him to fetch the mule in. When the mule come in the door, he gin a snort and started for the bed, just like he was going to jump on it. "Hol' on there, Brer Primus," the Conjure man hollered. "I's monstrous weak, and if you commence on me, you won't never have no chance for to get turned back no more." The mule seed the sense of that, and stood still. Then the Conjure man took the gourds and bottles and meant to work the roots and yerbs, and the mule meant to turn back to a man. First his ears, then the rest of his head, then his shoulders and arms. All the time the Conjure man kept on working his roots, and Pete and Primus could see he was getting weaker and weaker all the time. "Brer Pete," says he by and by, "gimme a drink of them bitters out in that green bottle on the shelf yonder. I's gone fast, and it'll give me strength for to finish this work." Brer Pete look up on the mantelpiece, and he see the bottle in the corner. It was so dark in the cabin he couldn't tell whether it was a green bottle or no. but he hilt the bottle to the conjure man's mouth, and it took a big mouthful. He hadn't mo' than swallowed it before he 'mence to holler. "You give me the wrong bottle, Brer Pete. Dis yer bottle's got pizen in it, and I's done for dis time, sho'. Hold me up for the Lord's sake, till I get through turnin' Brer Primus back." So Pete held him up, and he kept on workin' the roots, till he got the goopher all took off'n Brer Primus 'ceptin' one foot. He hadn't got dis foot mo' d'n half turnt back before his strengt gun out entirely, and he drapped the roots and fell back on the bed. "I can't do no mo' for you, Brer Primus," says he, "but I hopes you will forgive me for what harm I done you. I knows de good Lord done forgive me, and I hope to meet you both in glory. I sees de good angels waitin' for me up yonder with a long white robe and a starry crown, and I'm on my way to join 'em." And so the conjure man died, and Pete and Primus went back to the plantation. The darkies all made a great 'miration when Primus come back. Mars Jim let on like he didn't believe the tale the two niggers told. He says Primus had run away and stayed till he got tired of the swamps, and then come back on 'em to be fed. He tried to account for the shape of Primus's foot by saying Primus got his foot smashed, a snake bit or something, whilst he was away, and then stayed out in the woods where he couldn't get it cured up straight, 'stead of comin' 'long home where a doctor could 'a' tended to it. But the niggers all noticed the marster didn't tie Primus up, nor take on much 'cause the mule was gone. So they 'lowed their marster must 'a' had his suspicions 'bout dat conjure man. My wife had listened to Julius's recital with only a mild interest. When the old man had finished it, she remarked, "That story does not appeal to me, Uncle Julius, and is not up to your usual mark. It isn't pathetic. It has no moral that I can discover, and I can't see why you should tell it. In fact, it seems to me like nonsense." The old man looked puzzled as well as pained. He had not pleased the lady, and he did not seem to understand why. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said reproachfully, "if you don't like dat tale. I can't make out what you means by some of dem words you uses, but I'm tellin' nuffin but de truth. Co'se I didn't see de conjure man turn 'im back, for I wasn't dere, but I be'n hearin' de tale fer 25 years, and I ain't got no 'casion fer to 'spute it. Dey's so many things a body knows is lies, dat dey ain't no use gwine roun' findin' fault wid tales dat might jes' as well be so as not. Fer instance, dere's a young nigger gone to school in town, and he come out here de other day and 'lowed dat de sun stood still and de earth turnt roun' every day on a kinder axle tree. I tole dat young nigger ef he didn't take hisse'f away wid dem lies, I'd take a buggy trace to 'im. For I sees de earth standin' still all de time, and I sees de sun goin' aroun' it, and ef a man can't believe what he sees, I can't see no use in livin'. Might's well die and be where we can't see nuffin. And another thing what proves the tale 'bout dis ole Primus is the way he goes on ef anybody asks him how he come by dat club foot. I asked him one day, mighty polite and civil, and he called me a ole fool and got so mad he ain't spoke to me sence. It's monstrous queer. But dis is a queer world, any way you could fix it," concluded the old man with a weary sigh. "If you makes up your mind not to buy dat mule, suh," he added as he rose to go, "I knows a man what's got a good hoss he wants to sell. Leastways, dat's w'at I heerd. I'm gwine to prayer meetin' ter night, and I'm gwine right by de man's house, and ef you'd like ter take a look at de hoss, I'll ax him to fetch him roun'." "Oh, yes," I said, "you can ask him to stop in if he is passing. There will be no harm in looking at the horse, though I rather think I shall buy a mule." Early next morning the man brought the horse up to the vineyard. At that time I was not a very good judge of horse flesh. The horse appeared sound and gentle, and, as the owner assured me, had no bad habits. The man wanted a large price for the horse, but finally agreed to accept a much smaller sum, upon payment of which I became possessed of a very fine looking animal. But alas for the deceitfulness of appearances! I soon ascertained that the horse was blind in one eye, and that the sight of the other was very defective, and not a month elapsed before my purchase developed most of the diseases that horseflesh is heir to, and a more worthless, broken-winded, spavined quadruped never disgraced the noble name of horse. After worrying through 2 or 3 months of life, he expired one night in a fit of the colic. I replaced him with a mule, and Julius henceforth had to take his chances of driving some metamorphosed unfortunate. Circumstances that afterwards came to my knowledge created in my mind a strong suspicion that Julius may have played a more than unconscious part in this transaction. Among other significant facts was his appearance, the Sunday following the purchase of the horse, in a new suit of store clothes, which I had seen displayed in the window of Mr. Solomon Cohen's store on my last visit to town, and had remarked on account of their striking originality of cut and pattern. As I had not recently paid Julius any money, and as he had no property to mortgage, I was driven to conjecture to account for his possession of the means to buy the clothes. Of course I would not charge him with duplicity unless I could prove it, at least to a moral certainty, but for a long time afterwards I took his advice only in small doses and with great discrimination. End of The Conjurer's Revenge. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 5 of The Conjure Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. Section 5 of The Conjure Woman by Charles Waddell CHESNUTT. Sis Becky's Pickaninny. We had not lived in North Carolina very long before I was able to note a marked improvement in my wife's health. The ozone-laden air of the surrounding piney woods, the mild and equable climate, the peaceful leisure of country life, had brought about in hopeful measure the cure we had anticipated. Toward the end of our second year, however, her ailment took an unexpected turn for the worse. She became the victim of a settled melancholy, attended with vague forebodings of impending misfortune. "You must keep up her spirits," said our physician, the best in the neighboring town. "This melancholy lowers her tone too much, tends to lessen her strength, and if it continue too long, may be fraught with grave consequences." I tried various expedients to cheer her up. I read novels to her. I had the hands on the place come up in the evening and serenade her with plantation songs. Friends came in sometimes and talked, and frequent letters from the North kept her in touch with her former home. But nothing seemed to rouse her from the depression into which she had fallen. One pleasant afternoon in spring, I placed an armchair in a shaded portion of the front piazza, and filling it with pillows, led my wife out of the house and seated her where she would have the pleasantest view of a somewhat monotonous scenery. She was scarcely placed when old Julius came through the yard, and, taking off his tattered straw hat, inquired somewhat anxiously, "How is you feelin' dis afternoon, ma'am?" "She is not very cheerful, Julius," I said. My wife was apparently without energy enough to speak for herself. The old man did not seem inclined to go away, so I asked him to sit down. I had noticed, as he came up, that he held some small object in his hand. When he had taken his seat on the top step, he kept fingering this object. What it was I could not quite make out. "What is that you have there, Julius?" I asked with mild curiosity. "Dis is my rabbit foot, suh." This was at a time before this curious superstition had attained its present jocular popularity among white people, and while I had heard of it before, it had not yet outgrown the charm of novelty. "What do you do with it?" "I kyars it wid me for luck, suh." "Julius," I observed half to him and half to my wife, Your people will never rise in the world until they throw off these childish superstitions and learn to live by the light of reason and common sense. How absurd to imagine that the 4 foot of a poor dead rabbit, with which he timorously felt his way along through a life surrounded by snares and pitfalls, beset by enemies on every hand, can promote happiness or success, or ward off failure or misfortune. "It is ridiculous," assented my wife with faint interest. "Dat's what I tells dese niggers roun' here," said Julius. "De foot ain't got no power. It has to be de hind foot, suh. De lef hind foot er a graveyard rabbit kilt by a cross-eyed nigger on a dark night in de full of de moon." "They must be very rare and valuable," I said. "Dey is kinder scarce, suh, en dey ain' no 'mount er money could buy mine, suh. I might len' it ter anybody I saw stop by, but I wouldn't sell it. No, indeed, suh, I wouldn't." "How do you know it brings good luck?" I asked. "'Cause I ain' had no bad luck sence I had it, suh, en I's had dis rabbit foot fer 40 years. I had a good marster befo' de wah, en I wasn't sol' away, en I was sot free, en dat is all good luck." "But that doesn't prove anything," I rejoined. "Many other people have gone through a similar experience, and probably more than one of them had no rabbit's foot." "Law, suh, you don't have ter prove 'bout de rabbit foot. Eve'ybody knows dat. Leastways, eve'ybody roun' here knows it. But ef it has ter be proved ter folks w'at wa'n't born en raise' in dis neighborhood, dey is a easy way ter prove it. Is I eber tole you de tale er Sis' Becky en a Pickaninny?" "No," I said. "Let us hear it." I thought perhaps the story might interest my wife as much or more than the novel I had meant to read from. "Dis yer Becky," Julius began, "use' ter belong ter ole Colonel Pen'leton, who owned a plantation down on de Wim'l'ton Road, 'bout 10 miles from here, des befo' you gits ter Black Swamp. Dis yer Becky wuz a fiel' han', en a monst'us good 'un. She had a husban' oncet, a nigger w'at belonged ter de nex' plantation. But de man w'at owned her husban' died, en his lan' en his niggers had ter be sole fer ter pay his debts. Colonel Pen'leton 'lowed he'd 'a' bought dis nigger, but he had be'n bettin' on hoss races, en didn' have no money, en so Becky's husban' wuz sole away ter Virginny. Co'se Becky went on some 'bout losin' her man, but she couldn't help herse'f, en 'sides dat, she had a pickaninny fer ter comfort her. Dis yer little Mose wuz de cutest, blackish, shiny-eyedest little nigger you eber laid eyes on, en he wuz ez fon' er his mammy ez his mammy wuz er him. Co'se Becky had ter wuk en didn' have much time ter was'e wid her baby. Ole Aun Nancy, de plantation nuss down at de quarters, use' ter take keer of little Mose in de daytime, en atter de niggers come in fum de cotton fiel', Becky 'ud git her chile en kiss 'im en nuss 'im en keep 'im till mawnin', en on Sundays she'd have 'im in de cabin wid her all day long. Sis' Becky had got sorter use' ter gittin' 'long widout her husban', when one day Colonel Pen'leton went ter de races. Co'se, w'en he went ter de races, he tuk his hosses, en co'se he bet on his own hosses, en co'se he los' his money, fer Colonel Pen'leton didn' neber have no luck wid his hosses, ef he did keep hisse'f po' projeckin' wid 'em. But dis time dere wuz a hoss name' Lightnin' Bug, w'at belonged ter anudder man, en dis hoss won de sweepstakes, en Colonel Pen'leton tuk a likin' ter dat hoss, en ax' his owner w'at he wuz willin' ter take fer 'im. 'I'll take $1,000 fer dat hoss,' sez dis yer man, who had a big plantation down to'ds Wim'l'ton, where he raised hosses fer ter race en ter sell. Well, Colonel Pen'leton scratch his head en wonder whar he wuz gwine ter raise $1,000, en he didn' see des how he could do it, fer he owed ez much ez he could borrow already on de sciotity he could gib. But he wuz des boun' ter hab dat hoss, so sez he, 'I'll gib you my note fer $1,100 fer dat hoss.' De other man shook his head en sezee, 'Yo' note, suh, is better'n gold, I don't doubt, but I's made it a rule in my business not ter take no notes from nobody. Howsomeber, suh, ef you is kinder short er funds, mos' likely we kin make some kinder bargain. and whiles we is talking, I might's well say that I needs another good nigger down in my place. If you is got a good one to spare, I might trade with you." Now, Colonel Pennington didn't really have no niggers for to spare, but he lied to hisself he was just bleezed to have that horse, and so he says he, "Well, I don't like to, but I reckon I have to. You come out to my plantation tomorrow and look over my niggers, and pick out the one you wants." So, sure enough, next day this yer man come out to Colonel Pennington's place, and rid round the plantation and glanced at the niggers, and who should he pick out from 'em all but Sis' Becky. "I needs a new nigger woman down to my place," says he, "for to cook and wash and so on, and that young woman'll just fill the bill. You gimme her, and you can have Lightning Bug." Now, Colonel Pennington didn't like to trade Sis' Becky, 'cause she was nigh about the best field hand he had. Besides, Mars Colonel didn't care to take the mammies away from dey children whiles dey children was little. But this man say he want Becky, or else Colonel Pennington couldn't have the race hoss. "Well," says the colonel, "you can have the woman, but I don't like to send her away from her baby. What'll you give me for that nigger baby?" "I don't want the baby," says the other man. "I ain't got no use for that baby." "I'll tell you what I'll do," 'lows Colonel Pennington. "I'll throw that Pickaninny in for good measure." But the other man shook his head. "No," says he, "I's much obleeged, but I don't raise niggers. I raise hosses, and I don't want to be botherin' with no nigger babies. Never mind the baby. I'll keep that woman so busy she'll forget the baby, for niggers is made to work, and they ain't got no time for no such foolishness as babies." Colonel Pennington didn't want to hurt Becky's feelings, for Colonel Pennington was a kind-hearted man, and never liked to make no trouble for nobody, and so he told Becky he was going to send her down to Robeson County for a day or so to help out his son-in-law in his work, and being as this other man was going that way, he had asked him to take her along in his buggy. "Can I carry little Mose with me, massa?" asked Sis Becky. "No," says the colonel, as if he was studying whether to let her take him or no. "I reckon you better let Aunt Nancy look after your baby for the day or two you'll be gone, and she'll see that he gets enough to eat till you gets back." So Sis Becky hugged and kissed little Mose, and told him to be a good little Pickaninny and take care of hisself, and not forget his mammy while she was gone. And little Mose put his arms around his mammy and laughed and crowed just like it was monstrous fine fun for his mammy to go away and leave him. Well, this here hoss trader started out with Becky, and by, after they'd gone down the Lumberton road for a few miles or so, this man turned round in a different direction, and kept going that way, till by Sis Becky up and asked him if he was going to Robeson County by a new road. "Nah, nigger," says he, "I ain't going to Robeson County at all. I's going to Bladen County, where my plantation is, and where I raises all my hosses." "But how is I going to get to Miss Laura's plantation down in Robeson County?" says Becky, with her heart in her mouth, for she commenced to get skeered all of a sudden. "You ain't going to get there at all," says the man. "You belongs to me now, for I done traded my best race hoss for you, with your old massa. If you's a good gal, I'll treat you right, and if you don't behave yourself, why, what else happens'll be your own fault." 'Course Sis Becky cried and went on about a Pickaninny, but 'course it didn't do no good, and by they got down to this yer man's place, and he put Sis Becky to work, and forgot all about her having a Pickaninny. Meanwhiles, when evening come, the day Sis Becky was took away, little Mose commenced to get restless, and by, when his mammy didn't come, he started to cry for her. Aunt Nancy fed him and rocked him, and finally he just cried and cried till he cried himself to sleep. The next day he didn't 'pear to be as peart as usual, and when night come he fretted and went on worse'n he did the night before. The next day his little eyes commenced to lose dey shine, and he wouldn't eat nuffin, and he commenced to look so peaked dat Aunt Nancy took and carried him up to the big house and showed him to her ole missus, and her ole missus gun her some medicine for him, and 'lowed if he didn't get no better she should fetch him up to the big house again, and dey'd have a doctor, en nuss little Mose up dere, for Aunt Nancy's ole missus 'lowed he was a lackly little nigger en wuth raisin'. But Aunt Nancy had learnt to like little Mose, en she didn't want to have him took up to the big house. En so when he didn't get no better, she gathered a mess of green peas en took the peas and the baby en went to see ole Aunt Peggy, the Conjure Woman down by the Wimbledon Road. She gun Aunt Peggy the mess of peas en tole her about Sis Becky and little Mose. "Dat is a monstrous small mess of peas you is fotch me," says Aunt Peggy, says she. "Yes, I knows," 'lowed Aunt Nancy, "but dis yer is a monstrous small pickaninny." "You'll have to fetch me somethin' mo'," says Aunt Peggy, "for you can't 'spect me to waste my time diggin' roots en workin' conjuration for nuffin." "All right," says Aunt Nancy, "I'll fetch you somethin' mo' nex' time." "You better," says Aunt Peggy, "er else dere'll be trouble. What dis yer little pickaninny needs is to see his mammy. You leave 'im here dis evenin', en I'll show 'im his mammy." So when Aunt Nancy had gone away, Aunt Peggy took en worked her roots, en turnt little Mose to a hummin' bird, en sont 'im off fer ter find his mammy. So little Mose flewed en flewed en flewed away, till by he got to the place whar Sis Becky belonged. He seed his mammy workin' roun' de yard, en he could tell from lookin' at her dat she was troubled in her min' 'bout somethin', en feelin' kinder po'ly. Sis Becky heared somethin' hummin' roun' en roun' her, sweet en low. Fus' she 'lowed it was a hummin' bird, den she thought it sounded like her little Mose, croonin' on her breas', way back yonder on the ole plantation. En she jes' imagined it was her little Mose, en it made her feel better, en she went on 'bout her work pearter 'n she'd done sence she'd be'n down dere. Little Mose stayed roun' till late in the evenin', en den flewed back as hard as he could to Aunt Peggy. As for Sis Becky, she dreamt all dat night dat she was holdin' her pickaninny in her arms, en kissin' him en nussin' him, jes' like she used ter do back on the ole plantation where he was born. En for 3 or 4 days Sis Becky went 'bout her work wid mo' spirit dan she'd showed sence she'd be'n down dere to dis man's plantation. De nex' day atter he come back, little Mose was mo' pearter en better 'n he had be'n fer a long time. But to'ds de een' er de week he 'mence' ter git restless ag'in en stop eatin', en Aunt Nancy kyar'd him down to Aunt Peggy once mo', en she turnt him to a mockin' bird dis time, en sont him off to see his mammy ag'in. It didn't take him long fer ter git dere, en w'en he did, he seed his mammy standin' in de kitchen lookin' back in de direction little Mose was comin' fum, en dey was tears in her eyes, en she looked mo' po'ly en peaked 'n she had w'en he was down dere befo'. So little Mose sot on a tree in de yard en sung en sung en sung, jes' fittin' ter split his throat. Fus' Sis Becky didn't notice him much, but dis mockin' bird kep' stayin' roun' de house all day, en by Sis Becky jes' 'magined dat mockin' bird was her little Mose, crowin' en crowin', jes' like he used ter do w'en his mammy would come home at night fum de cotton fiel'. De mockin' bird stayed roun' dere mos' all day, en w'en Sis Becky went out in de yard one time, dis yer mockin' bird lit on her shoulder en peck at de piece of bread she was eatin', en fluttered his wings so dey rub up agin de side of her head. En w'en he flewed away 'long late in de evenin', des 'fo' sundown, Sis Becky felt mo' better 'n she had sence she had heared dat hummin' bird a week er so pas', en dat night she dreamt 'bout ole times ag'in, des like she did befo'. But dis yer totin' little Mose down to ole Aunt Peggy, en dis yer gittin' things fer ter pay de Conjure Woman use up a lot of Aunt Nancy's time, en she begun ter git kinder tired. 'Sides dat, w'en Sis Becky had be'n on de plantation, she had used ter help Aunt Nancy wid de young'uns evenin's en Sundays. En Aunt Nancy commenced ter miss her monst'us, 'specially sence she got a tech er de rheumatiz herse'f, en so she 'lows ter ole Aunt Peggy one day, "Aunt Peggy, ain't dey no way you kin fetch Sis Becky back home?" "Huh," says Aunt Peggy, "I don' know 'bout dat. I'll have ter work my roots en fin' out whether I can er no, but it'll take a monst'us heap er work, en I can't waste my time fer nuffin. Ef you'll fetch me somethin' ter pay me fer my trouble, I reckon we kin fix it." So nex' day Aunt Nancy went down to see Aunt Peggy ag'in. "Aunt Peggy," says she, "I has fotch you my best Sunday head handkercher. Will dat do?" Aun Peggy look at de head handkercher and run her hand over it, and says she, 'Yes, dat'll do fus' rate. I's be'n workin' my roots sence you be'n gone, and I 'lows mos' lackly I kin git Sis' Becky back, but it's gwine take figgerin' and studyin' as well as conjurin'. De fus' thing to do 'll be to stop fetchin' dat Pickaninny down here, and not sen' 'im to see his mammy no mo'. Ef he gits too po'ly, you lemme know, and I'll give you some kind er mixtry fer ter make 'im fergit Sis' Becky fer a week er so. So less'n you comes fer dat, you needn't ter come back ter see me no mo' till I sends fer you.' So Aun Peggy sont Aun Nancy away, and the fus' thing she done wuz ter call a hornet from her nes' under her eaves. 'You go up to Kunnel Pen'leton's stable, Hornet,' says she, 'and sting de knees of a race hoss named Lightnin' Bug. Be sho' and git the right one.' So the hornet flewed up to Kunnel Pen'leton's stable and stung Lightnin' Bug roun' de legs, and de nex' mawnin' Lightnin' Bug's knees wuz all swole up, twicet ez big ez dey oughter be. When Kunnel Pen'leton went out ter de stable and see de hoss's legs, it would 'a' des made you tremble like a leaf fer ter hear him cuss dat hoss traitor. Howsomeber, he cool off bimeby, and tole de stable boy fer ter rub Lightnin' Bug's legs wid some linimum. De boy done ez his marster tole 'im, and by de nex' day de swellin' had gone down consid'able. Aun Peggy had sont a sparrer w'at had a nes' in one er de trees close to her cabin fer ter watch w'at wuz gwine on roun' de big house, and w'en dis yer sparrer tole her de hoss wuz gittin' ober de swellin', she sont de hornet back fer ter sting his knees some mo', and de nex' mawnin' Lightnin' Bug's legs wuz swole up wuss'n dan befo'. Well, dis time Kunnel Pen'leton wuz mad thoo en thoo, en all de way roun', en he cussed dat hoss traitor up en down, from A to Izzard. He cussed so hard dat de stable boy got mos' scared ter death, en went off en hid hisse'f in de hay. As fer Kunnel Pen'leton, he went right up to de house en got out his pen en ink, en took off his coat en roll' up his sleeves, en writ a letter to dis yer hoss traitor, en says he, 'You is sol' me a hoss w'at is got a ring bone or a spavin er somethin', en w'at I paid you fer wuz a soun' hoss. I want you ter sen' my nigger woman back, en take yo' ole hoss, or else I'll sue you sho's you bawn.' But dis yer man wa'n't skeered a bit, en he writ back to Kunnel Pen'leton dat a bargain wuz a bargain, dat Lightnin' Bug wuz soun' w'en he sol' 'im, en ef Kunnel Pen'leton didn't know enough about hosses to take care of a fine racer, dat wuz his own funeral, en dey say Kunnel Pen'leton kin sue en be cussed fer all he keer, but he ain't gwine ter give up de nigger he bought en paid fer." When Kunnel Pen'leton got dis letter, he wuz mad'n he wuz befo', 'specially 'cause the man 'lowed he didn't know how to take care of fine hosses. But he couldn't do nuffin but fetch a lawsuit, en he knowed by his own 'sperience dat lawsuits wuz slow ez a 7-year itch, en cost mo' d'n dey come ter, en he 'lowed he better go slow en wait a while. Aun Peggy knowed w'at wuz gwine on all dis time, en she fix' up a little bag wid some roots en one thing er anudder in it, en gun it to dis sparrer er her'n, en tole 'im ter take it way down yonder whar Sis' Becky wuz, en drap it right befo' de do' er her cabin, so she'd be sho' en fin' it de fus time she come out'n de do'. One night Sis' Becky dreamt her Pickaninny was dead, en de nex' day she wuz moanin' en groanin' all day. She dreamt de same dream 3 nights runnin', en den, de nex' mawnin' atter de las' night, she foun' dis yer little bag de sparrer had drap' in front er her do', en she 'lowed she'd be'n conjured, en wuz gwine ter die, en ez long ez her Pickaninny wuz dead, dey wa'n't no use tryin' ter do nuffin nohow. En so she tuk en went ter bed, en tole her marster she'd be'n conjured, en wuz gwine ter die. Her marster laughed at her, en argued wid her, en tried ter 'suade her out er dis yer fool notion, ez he called it, fer he wuz one er dese yer w'ite folks w'at p'ten' dey don't believe in conjurin', but it wa'n't no use. Sis' Becky kep' gittin' wusser en wusser, till fin'ly dis yer man 'lowed Sis' Becky wuz gwine ter die sho' 'nuff, en as he knowed dey hadn't be'n nuffin de matter wid Lightnin' Bug w'en he traded 'im, he 'lowed maybe he could cure 'im en fetch 'im roun' all right, leastways good 'nuff ter sell ag'in. En anyhow, a lame hoss wuz better'n a dead nigger. So he set down en writ Kunnel Pen'leton a letter. "My conscience," says he, has been troublin' me 'bout dat ring-bone hoss I sole you. Some folks 'lows a hoss trader ain' got no conscience, but dey don't know me, for dat is my weak spot, an' de reason I ain' made no mo' money hoss tradin'. Fac' is,' sez he, 'I's got so I can't sleep nights from studyin' 'bout dat spavin' hoss, an' I's made up my min' dat w'iles a bargain is a bargain, an' you seed Lightnin' Bug befo' you traded fer 'im, principle is wuth mo' d'n money, or hosses, or niggers. So ef you'll sen' Lightnin' Bug down here, I'll sen' yo' nigger woman back, an' we'll call de trade off, an' be as good frien's as we eber wuz, an' no hard feelin's.' So, sho' 'nuff, Kunnel Pen'leton sont de hoss back, an' w'en de man w'at come ter bring Lightnin' Bug tol' Sis' Becky her pickaninny wa'n't dead, Sis' Becky wuz so glad dat she 'lowed she wuz gwine ter try ter live till she got back whar she could see little Mose once mo'. An' w'en she retch de ole plantation an' seed her baby kickin' an' crowin' an' holdin' out his little arms to'ds her, she wush she wa'n't conjured an' didn' have ter die. An' w'en Aun' Nancy tol' her all about Aun Peggy, Sis' Becky went down ter see de Conjure Woman, an' Aun Peggy tol' her she had conjured her. An' den Aun Peggy tuk de goopher off'n her, an' she got well, an' stayed on de plantation, an' raise' her pickaninny. An' w'en little Mose growed up, he could sing an' whistle des like a mockin' bird, so dat de w'ite folks useter hab 'im come up ter de big house at night, an' whistle an' sing fer 'im, an' dey useter give 'im money, an' vittles, an' one thing er 'nudder, which he alluz tuk home to his mammy, fer he knowed all 'bout w'at she had gone th'oo. He turnt out ter be a smart man, an' learnt de blacksmith trade, an' Kunnel Pen'leton let 'im high his time. An' bimeby he bought his mammy, an' sot her free, an' den he bought hisse'f, an' tuk care er Sis' Becky ez long ez dey bofe libbed." My wife had listened to this story with greater interest than she had manifested in any subject for several days. I had watched her furtively from time to time during the recital, and had observed the play of her countenance. It had expressed in turn sympathy, indignation, pity, and, at the end, lively satisfaction. "That is a very ingenious fairy tale, Julius," I said, "and we are much obliged to you." "Why, John," said my wife severely, "the story bears the stamp of truth, if ever a story did." "Yes," I replied, "especially the humming bird episode and the mocking bird digression, to say nothing of the doings of the hornet and the sparrow." "Oh, well, I don't care," she rejoined with delightful animation. "Those are mere ornamental details, and not at all essential. The story is true to nature, and might have happened half a hundred times, and no doubt did happen in those horrid days before the war." "By the way, Julius," I remarked, "your story doesn't establish what you started out to prove, that a rabbit's foot brings good luck." "It's plain 'nuff ter me, suh," replied Julius. "I bet young missis dere kin 'splain it herse'f." "I rather suspect," replied my wife promptly, "that Sis' Becky had no rabbit's foot." "You is hit de bull's eye de fus' fire, ma'am," assented Julius. "Ef Sis' Becky had had a rabbit foot, she neber would 'a' went th'ough all dis trouble." I went into the house for some purpose, and left Julius talking to my wife. When I came back a moment later he was gone. My wife's condition took a turn for the better from this very day, and she was soon on the way to ultimate recovery. Several weeks later, after she had resumed her afternoon drives, which had been interrupted by her illness, Julius brought the rockaway round to the front door one day, and I assisted my wife into the carriage. "John," she said before I had taken my seat, "I wish you would look in my room and bring me my handkerchief. You will find it in the pocket of my blue dress." I went to execute the commission. When I pulled the handkerchief out of her pocket, something else came with it and fell on the floor. I picked up the object and looked at it. It was Julius's rabbit's foot. End of Sis' Becky's Pickaninny. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 6 of the Conjure Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. Section 6 of The Conjure Woman by Charles Waddell CHESNUTT. The Gray Wolf's Haunt. It was a rainy day at the vineyard. The morning had dawned bright and clear. But the sky had soon clouded, and by 9 o'clock there was a light shower, followed by others at brief intervals. By noon the rain had settled into a dull, steady downpour. The clouds hung low, and seemed to grow denser instead of lighter as they discharged their watery burden, and there was now and then a muttering of distant thunder. Outdoor work was suspended, and I spent most of the day at the house, looking over my accounts and bringing up some arrears of correspondence. Towards 4 o'clock I went out on the piazza, which was broad and dry, and less gloomy than the interior of the house, and composed myself for a quiet smoke. I had lit my cigar and opened the volume I was reading at that time, when my wife, whom I had left dozing on a lounge, came out and took a rocking chair near me. "I wish you would talk to me, or read to me, or something," she exclaimed petulantly. "It's awfully dull here to day." "I'll read to you with pleasure," I replied, and began at the point where I had found my bookmark. The difficulty of dealing with transformations so many-sided as those which all existences have undergone, or are undergoing, is such as to make a complete and deductive interpretation almost hopeless. So to grasp the total process of redistribution of matter and motion, as to see simultaneously its several necessary results in their actual interdependence, is scarcely possible. There is, however, a mode of rendering the process as a whole tolerably comprehensible. Though the genesis of the rearrangement of every evolving aggregate is in itself one, it presents to our intelligence— "John," interrupted my wife, "I wish you would stop reading that nonsense and see who that is coming up the lane." I closed my book with a sigh. I had never been able to interest my wife in the study of philosophy, even when presented in the simplest and most lucid form. Some one was coming up the lane, at least a huge faded cotton umbrella was making progress toward the house, and beneath it a pair of nether extremities in trousers was discernible. Any doubt in my mind as to whose they were was soon resolved when Julius reached the steps, and, putting the umbrella down, got a good dash of the rain as he stepped up on the porch. "Why in the world, Julius," I asked, "didn't you keep the umbrella up until you got under cover?" "It's bad luck, suh, to raise a umbrella in the house, and whiles I don't know whether it's bad luck to carry one into the piazza or no, I 'lows it's alluz best to be on the safe side. I didn't s'pose you and young missis 'ud be goin' on your dribe to day, but bein' as it's my part to take you if you does, I 'lowed I'd report for duty, and let you say whether or no you wants to go." "I'm glad you came, Julius," I responded. "We don't want to go driving, of course, in the rain, but I should like to consult you about another matter. I'm thinking of taking in a piece of new ground. What do you imagine it would cost to have that neck of woods down by the swamp cleared up?" The old man's countenance assumed an expression of unwonted seriousness, and he shook his head doubtfully. "I don't know 'bout dat, suh. It mought cost mo', and it mought cost less, as fur as money is consarned. I ain't denyin' you could cl'ar up dat trac' of lan' fer $100 or a couple of $100, ef you wants to cl'ar it up. But ef dat 'uz my trac' of lan', I wouldn't disturb it, no suh, I wouldn't. Sho's you bawn, I wouldn't." "But why not?" I asked. "It ain't fittin' fer grapes, fer new ground nebber is." "I know it, but—" "It ain't no yearthly good fer cotton, 'cause it's too low." "Perhaps, but it will raise splendid corn." "I don't know," rejoined Julius deprecatorially. "It's so near de swamp dat de coons'll eat up all de corn." "I think I'll risk it," I answered. "Well, suh," said Julius, "I wishes you much joy of your job. If you has bad luck, er sickness, er trouble er any kind, don't blame me. You can't say old Julius didn't warn you." "Warn him of what, Uncle Julius?" asked my wife. "Er de bad luck w'at follers folks w'at 'sturbs dat trac' of lan'. Dey is snakes en scorpions in dem woods, en ef you manages ter 'scape de p'ison animals, you is des boun' ter hab a haunt ter settle wid, ef you don't hab two." "Whose haunt?" my wife demanded with growing interest. "De gray wolf's haunt, some folks calls it, but I knows better." "Tell us about it, Uncle Julius," said my wife. "A story will be a godsend to day." It was not difficult to induce the old man to tell a story, if he were in a reminiscent mood. Of tales of the old slavery days he seemed indeed to possess an exhaustless store, some weirdly grotesque, some broadly humorous, some bearing the stamp of truth, faint perhaps, but still discernible, others palpable inventions, whether his own or not we never knew, though his fancy doubtless embellished them. But even the wildest was not without an element of pathos, the tragedy, it might be, of the story itself, the shadow, never absent, of slavery and of ignorance, the sadness always of life as seen by the fading light of an old man's memory. "Way back yonder, befo' de wah," began Julius, "ole Mars Dugal' McAdoo use' ter own a nigger name' Dan. Dan was big en strong en hearty en peaceable en good natured, most er de time, but dangerous ter aggravate. He alluz done his task, en never had no trouble wid de w'ite folks, but woe be unto a nigger w'at 'lowed he could fool wid Dan, fer he wuz mos' sho' ter git a good lammin'. Soon ez eve'body foun' Dan out, dey didn' many of 'em 'tempt ter 'sturb 'im. De one dat did would 'a wush' he hadn', ef he could 'a' libbed long enough ter do any wushin'. It all happen' dis a way. Dey wuz a cunjuh man w'at libbed over ter de udder side er de Lumberton Road. He had be'n de only cunjuh doctor in de neighborhood fer 'long dis many years, 'tel ole Aun Peggy sot up in de business down by de Wim'l'ton Road. Dis cunjuh man had a son w'at libbed wid 'im, en it wuz dis yer son w'at got mix' up wid Dan, en all 'bout a 'oman. Dey wuz a gal on de plantation name' Mahaly. She wuz a monst'us lackly gal, tall en supple, wid big eyes en a small foot, en a lively tongue, en w'en Dan tuk ter gwine wid her, eve'ybody 'lowed dey wuz well match', en none er de other nigger men on de plantation dares ter go near her, fer dey wuz all feared er Dan. Now it happen' dat dis yer cunjuh man's son wuz gwine 'long de road one day, w'en who should come pas' but Mahaly, en de minute dis man sot eye on Mahaly, he 'lowed he wuz gwine ter hab her fer hisse'f. He come up side er her en 'mence' ter talk to her, but she didn' pay no 'tention ter him, fer she wuz studyin' 'bout Dan, en she didn' lack dis nigger's looks nohow. So w'en she got ter whar she wuz gwine, dis yer man wa'n't no furder 'long dan he wuz w'en he started. Co'se, atter he had made up his min' fer ter git Mahaly, he 'mence' ter 'quire roun', en soon foun' out all 'bout Dan, en w'at a dangerous nigger he wuz. But dis man 'lowed his daddy wuz a cunjuh man, en so he come out all right in de een', en he kep' right atter Mahaly. Meanwhiles, Dan's marster had said dey could git ma'd ef dey want her, en so Dan en Mahaly had tuk up wid one anudder, en wuz libbin' in a cabin by deyse'ves, en wuz des wrop up in one anudder. But dis yer cunjuh man's son didn' 'pear ter min' Dan's takin' up wid Mahaly, en he kep' on hangin' roun' des de same, 'tel fin'ly one day Mahaly says ter Dan, says she, 'I wish you'd do somethin' ter stop dat free nigger man fum followin' me roun'. I don' lack 'im nohow, en I ain' got no time fer ter was'e wid no man but you.' Co'se Dan got mad w'en he heard 'bout dis man pesterin' Mahaly, en de nex' night, w'en he seed dis nigger comin' 'long de road, he up en ax' 'im w'at he mean by hangin' roun' his 'oman. De man didn' 'spon' ter suit Dan, en one word led ter anudder, Till by and by dis conjure man's son pull out a knife and started to stick it in Dan. But before he could get it drawed good, Dan haul off and hit him in the head so hard that he never got up. Dan 'lowed he come to after a while and go along by the business, so he went off and left him laying there on the ground. The next morning the man was found dead. There was a great moderation made about it, but Dan didn't say nothing, and none of the other niggers hadn't seen the fight, so there wasn't no way to tell who done the killing. And being as it was a free nigger, and they wasn't no white folks specially interested, there wasn't nothing done about it, and the conjure man come and took his son and carried him away and buried him. Now Dan hadn't meant to kill this nigger, and whilst he knowed the man hadn't got no more than he deserved, Dan commenced to worry more or less, for he knowed this man's daddy would work his roots and probably find out who'd killed his son and make all the trouble for him he could. And Dan kept on studying about this till he got so he didn't hardly dare to eat or drink for fear this conjure man had poisoned the victuals or the water. Finally he 'lowed he'd go to see Aun Peggy, the new conjure woman what had moved down by the Wilmington Road, and ask her for to do something to protect him from this conjure man. So he took a peck of taters and went down to a cabin one night. Aun Peggy heard his tale, and then says she, "Dat conjure man is mo' den twice as old as I is, and he can make monstrous powerful goopher. What you needs is a life charm, and I'll make you one tomorrow. It's the only thing what'll do you any good. You leave me a couple of hairs from your head and fetch me a pig tomorrow night for the roast, and when you come, I'll have the charm all ready for you." So Dan went down to Aun Peggy the next night with a young shoat, and Aun Peggy gun him the charm. She had took the hairs Dan had left with her in a piece of red flannel, and some roots and yerbs, and had put 'em in a little bag made out of coon skin. "You take this charm," says she, "and put it in a bottle or a tin box, and bury it deep under the root of a live oak tree, and as long as it stays there safe and sound, there ain't no poison can poison you, there ain't no rattlesnake can bite you, there ain't no scorpion can sting you. This here conjure man might do one thing or another to you, but he can't kill you. So you need to be at all scared, but go along about your business and don't bother your mind." So Dan went down by the river, and way up on the bank he buried the charm deep under the root of a live oak tree, and covered it up and stomped the dirt down and scattered leaves over the spot, and then went home with his mind easy. Sure enough, this here conjure man worked his roots, just as Dan had expected he would, and soon learned who killed his son. And 'cause he made up his mind for to get even with Dan, so he sent a rattlesnake for to sting him. But the rattlesnake say the nigger's heels was so hard he couldn't get his sting in. Then he sent his jaybird for to put poison in Dan's victuals, but the poison didn't work. Then the conjure man 'lowed he'd double Dan all up with the rheumatiz, so he couldn't get his hand to his mouth to eat, and would have to starve to death. But Dan went to Aun Peggy, and she got him an ointment to cure the rheumatiz. Then the conjure man 'lowed he'd burn Dan up with a fever, but Aun Peggy told him how to make some yerb tea for that. Nuffin this man tried would kill Dan, so finally the conjure man 'lowed Dan must have a life charm. Now this here jaybird the conjure man had was a monstrous smart critter. Fact, the niggers 'lowed he was the old devil hisself, just sitting round waiting to carry this old man away when he reached the end of his rope. The conjure man sent this jaybird for to watch Dan and find out where he kept his charm. The jaybird hung round Dan for a week or so, and one day he see Dan go down by the river and look at a live oak tree, and then the jaybird went back to his master and told him he 'spect the nigger kept his life charm under that tree. The conjure man laughed and laughed, and he put on his biggest pot and filled it with his strongest roots, and boiled it, till by and by the wind blowed and blowed till it blowed down the live oak tree. Then he stirred some more roots in the pot, and it rained and rained till the water run down the river bank and washed Dan's life charm into the river, and the bottle went bobbing down the current just as unconcerned as if it wasn't taking po' Dan's chances all along with it. And then the conjure man laughed some more, and 'lowed to hisself dat he was gwine ter fix Dan now, sho' 'nuff. He wa'n't gwine ter kill him des yet, fer he could do somethin' to him w'at would hurt wusser'n killin'. So dis conjure man commenced ter gwine up ter Dan's cabin eve'y night, en takin' Dan out in his sleep, en ridin' him roun' de roads en fields over de rough groun'. In de mawnin' Dan would be as tired as ef he hadn't be'n ter sleep. Dis kinder thing kep' up fer a week er so, en Dan had des 'bout made up his min' fer ter go en see Aun Peggy ag'in, w'en who should he come across, gwine 'long de road one day to'ds sundown, but dis yer conjure man. Dan felt kinder skeered at fus', but den he 'membered 'bout his life cha'm, w'ich he hadn't be'n ter see fer a week er so, en 'lowed wuz safe en soun' under de live oak tree. En so he helt up his head en walked 'long des lack he didn't keer nuffin 'bout dis man no more'n any yuther nigger. W'en he got close ter de conjure man, dis conjure man sezee, "Howdy, Brer Dan, I hope you er well." W'en Dan seed de conjure man wuz in a good humor en didn't 'pear ter bear no malice, Dan 'lowed maybe de conjure man hadn't foun' out who killed his son, en so he 'termine' fer ter let on lack he didn't know nuffin, en so sezee, "Howdy, Uncle Jube." Dis ole conjure man's name wuz Jube. "I's putty well, thank you. How's you feelin' dis mawnin'?" "I's feelin' ez well ez ole nigger could feel w'at had los' his only son en his main dependence in his ole age. But den my son wuz a bad boy," sezee, "en I couldn't 'spec' nuffin e'se. I tried ter l'arn 'im de error er his ways en make 'im go ter chu'ch en prayer meetin', but it wa'n't no use. I don't know who killt 'im, en I don't wanter know, fer I'd be mos' sure ter find out dat my boy had started the fuss. Ef I'd had a son like you, Brer Dan, I'd 'a' be'n a proud nigger. Oh, yes, I would, sho's you bawn. But you ain't lookin' ez well ez you oughter, Brer Dan. Dey's somethin' de matter wid you, en w'at's mo', I 'spec' you don't know w'at it is." Now dis yer kinder talk nat'ally th'owed Dan off'n his guard, en fus' thing he knowed he wuz talkin' ter dis ole conjure man des lack he wuz one er his bes' frien's. He tole 'im all 'bout not feelin' well in de mawnin', en ax' 'im ef he could tell w'at wuz de matter wid 'im. "Yas," sez de conjure man, "dere's a witch be'n ridin' you right along. I kin see de marks er de bridle on yo' mouf. En I'll des bet yo' back is raw whar she be'n beatin' you." "Yas," respon' Dan, "so it is." He hadn't noticed it befo', but now he felt des lack de hide had be'n tuk off'n him. "En yo' thighs is des raw whar de spurs has be'n drivin' in you," sez de conjure man. "You can't see de raw spots, but you kin feel 'em." "Oh, yas," 'lows Dan, "dey does hurt powerful bad." "En w'at's mo'," sez de conjure man, comin' up close ter Dan en whisperin' in his year, "I knows who it is be'n ridin' you." "Who is it?" ax' Dan. "Tell me who it is." "It's a ole nigger woman down by Rockfish Crick. She had a pet rabbit, en you kotch 'im one day, en she's be'n squarin' up wid you eber sence. But you better stop her, er else she'll be rid ter death in a month er so." "No," sez Dan, "she can't kill me, sho'." "I don't know how dat is," said de conjure man, "but she kin make yo' life mighty mis'able. Ef I wuz in yo' place, I'd stop her right off." "But how is I gwine ter stop her?" ax' Dan. "I don't know nuffin 'bout stoppin' witches." "Look here, Dan," sez the other, "you is a good young man. I likes you monst'us well. Fac', I feels like some er dese days I mought buy you fum yo' marster, ef I could eber make money ernuff at my business dese hard times, en 'dopt you fer my son. I likes you so well dat I'm gwine ter help you git rid er dis yer witch fer good en all. Fer des ez long ez she libs, you is sho' ter have trouble en mo' trouble." "You is de bes' frien' I got, Uncle Jube," sez Dan, "en I'll 'member yo' kindness ter my dyin' day. Tell me how I kin git rid er dis yer ole witch w'at's be'n ridin' me so hard." "In de fus' place," sez de conjure man, "dis ole witch neber comes in her own shape, but eve'y night at 10 o'clock she turns herse'f into a black cat, en runs down ter yo' cabin en bridles you, en mounts you, en dribes you out thoo de chimbly, and ride you over the roughest places she can find. All you got to do is to set for her in the bushes side your cabin and hit her in the head with a rock or a lighted knot when she goes past." "But," says Dan, "how can I see her in the dark? And s'posen I hits her and misses her, or s'posen I just wounds her and she gets away, what's she gwine to do to me den?" "I's done studied 'bout all dem things," says de cunjuh man, "en it 'pears to me de bes' plan fer you to foller is to lemme turn you to some creetur w'at kin see in de dark, en w'at kin run des ez fas' ez a cat, en w'at kin bite, en bite fer to kill. En den you won't hafter have no trouble atter de job is done. I don't know whether you like dat er not, but dat is de sho'est way." "I don't care," 'spon' Dan. "I'd des ez lief be anything fer a' hour er so, ef I kin kill dat ole witch. You kin do des w'at you a min' ter." "All right, den," says the cunjuh man. "You come down to my cabin at half past 9 o'clock ter night, en I'll fix you up." Now dis cunjuh man, w'en he had got th'ough talkin' wid Dan, kep' on down de road 'long de side er de plantation, till he met Mahaly comin' home from work des atter sundown. "How de do, ma'am?" says he. "Is yo' name Sister Mahaly, w'at belongs ter Mars Dugal' McAdoo?" "Yes," respon' Mahaly, "dat's my name, en I belongs ter Mars Dugal'." "Well," says he, "yo' husban' Dan wuz down by my cabin dis ebenin', en he got bit by a spider er sump'n, en his foot is swole up so he can't walk, en he ax me fer ter fin' you en fetch you down dere ter he'p 'im home." Co'se Mahaly wanter see w'at had happen' ter Dan, en so she started down de road wid de cunjuh man. Ez soon ez he got her inter his cabin, he shet de do' en sprinkle some goopher mixtry on her, en tu'nt her to a black cat. Den he tuk en put her in a barrel, en put a board on de barrel, en a rock on de board, en lef her dere till he got good en ready fer ter use her. 'Long 'bout half pas' 9 o'clock, Dan come down to de cunjuh man's cabin. It was a warm night, en de do' was standin' open. De cunjuh man 'vised Dan to come in en pass de time er day wid him. Ez soon ez Dan commenced talkin', he heared a cat meowin' en scratchin' en gwine on at a turrible rate. "What's all dat fuss about?" ax Dan. "Oh, dat ain' nuffin but my ole gray tomcat," says de cunjuh man. "I has ter shet 'im up sometimes fer ter keep 'im in nights, en co'se he don't lack it." "Now," 'lows de cunjuh man, "lemme tell you des w'at you is got ter do. W'en you ketches dis witch, you mus' take her right by de throat en bite her right th'ough de neck. Be sho' yo' teef goes th'ough at de fus' bite, en den you won't never be bothered no mo' by dat witch. En w'en you git done, come back here en I'll turn you to yo'self ag'in, so you kin go home en git yo' night's res'." Den de cunjuh man gun Dan somethin' nice en sweet ter drink out'n a new gourd, en in 'bout a minute Dan foun' hisse'f tu'nt to a gray wolf, en soon ez he felt all four his new feet on de groun', he started off fas' ez he could fer his own cabin, so he could be sho' en be dere time enough to catch de witch en put a een to her carryin's on. Ez soon ez Dan wuz gone good, de cunjuh man tuk de rock off'n de board en de board off'n de barrel, en out lep Mahaly en started fer ter go home, des like a cat or a woman or anybody else would w'at wuz in trouble. En it wa'n't many minutes befo' she wuz gone up de path to her own do'. Meanwhiles, w'en Dan had retched de cabin, he had hid hisse'f in a bunch er jimson weeds in de yard. He hadn't waited long befo' he seed a black cat run up de path to'ds de do'. Des ez soon ez she got close to him, he leapt out en ketch her by de throat, en got a grip on her des like de cunjuh man had told him to do. En lo en behold, no sooner had de blood commenced ter flow den de black cat tu'nt back to Mahaly, en Dan seed dat he had kilt his own wife. En w'iles her breff wuz gone she call out, "Oh, Dan! Oh, my husban'! Come en he'p me! Come en save me fum dis wolf w'at's killin' me!" W'en po' Dan started to'ds her, as any man nat'ally would, it des made her holler wuss en wuss, fer she didn't know dis yer wolf wuz her Dan. En Dan des had ter hide in de weeds en grit his teef en hol hisse'f in till she passed out in her misery, calling for Dan to the last, and wondering why he didn't come and help her. And Dan 'lowed to hisself he'd ruther been kilt a dozen times than to done what he had to Mahaly. Dan was mighty nigh 'stracted, but when Mahaly was dead and he got his mind straightened out a little, it didn't take him mo' 'n a minute or so fer to see through all the cunjuh man's lies, and how the cunjuh man had fooled him and made him kill Mahaly fer to get even wid him fer killin' of his son. He kep' gettin' madder and madder, and Mahaly hadn't much mo' d'n drawed her last breath before he started back to the cunjuh man's cabin hard as he could run. When he got there, the door was standing open, a lighted knot was flicking on the hearth, and old cunjuh man was sitting there nodding in the corner. Dan leapt in the door and jumped for this man's throat, and got the same grip on him what the cunjuh man had told him about half hour before. It was hard work this time, for the old man's neck was monstrous tough and stringy, but Dan hilt on long enough to be sure his job was done right. And even then he didn't hold on long enough, for when he turned the cunjuh man loose and he fell over on the floor, the cunjuh man rolled his eyes at Dan and says he, "I's eben wid you, Brer Dan, and you er eben wid me. You kilt my son, and I kilt yo' woman. And as I don't want no mo' d'n what's fair 'bout dis thing, if you'll retch up wid yo' paw and take down dat gourd hanging on dat peg over the chimbley, and take a sip of dat mixtry, it'll turn you back to a nigger again, and I can die most satisfied 'n if I lef you like you is." Dan neber 'lowed for a minute dat a man would lie wid his last breath, and 'course he seed de sense er gittin' turnt back befo' the cunjuh man died, so he clumb on a chair and retched for the gourd and took a sip of the mixtry. And as soon as he done dat, the cunjuh man laughed his last laugh and gasped out wid his last gaps. "Uh-huh, I reckon I's square wid you now fer killin' me too, for dat goof on you is done fix and sot now fer good, and all the cunjuh in the world won't neber take it off. Wolf you is and wolf you stays, all the rest of yo' born days." Co'se Brer Dan couldn't do nuffin. He knowed it wa'n't no use, but he clummed up on the chimbley and got down the gourds and bottles and other cunjuh fixin's, and tried 'em all on hisself, but they didn't do no good. Den he run down to ole Aun Peggy, but she didn't know the wolf language, and couldn't 'a' took off dis other goopher nohow, even if she'd 'a' understood what Dan was sayin'. So po' Dan was 'bleeged to be a wolf all the rest of his born days. Dey found Mahaly down by her own cabin nex' mornin', and everybody made a great 'miration 'bout how she'd be'n kilt. The niggers 'lowed a wolf had bit her. The w'ite folks say no, dey ain' be'n no wolves roun' dere fer 10 years er mo', and dey didn't know what ter make out'n it. And when dey couldn't find Dan nowhere, dey 'lowed he'd quarreled wid Mahaly and kilt her, and run away, and dey didn't know what ter make er dat, fer Dan and Mahaly was de most lovin' couple on the plantation. Dey put de dogs on Dan's scent, and track 'im down to ole Uncle Jube's cabin, and found de ole man dead, and dey didn't know what ter make er dat. And den Dan's scent gun out, and dey didn't know what ter make er dat. Mars Dugal' took on a heap 'bout losin' two of his best han's in one day, and ole missus 'lowed it was a jedgment on him fer somethin' he'd done. But dat fall de crops was monst'us big, so Mars Dugal' say de Lord had tempered de wind to de shone ram, and make up to him fer what he had los'. Dey buried Mahaly down in dat piece of low groun' you were talkin' 'bout clearin' up. As fer po' Dan, he didn't have nowhere else to go, so he jest stayed roun' Mahaly's grave, when he wa'n't out in yonder woods gettin' somethin' to eat. And sometimes when night would come, the niggers used to hear him howlin' and howlin' down there, jest fittin' to break his heat. And then some mo' on 'em said dey seed Mahaly's haunt there 'bunance of times, colloguin' wid dis gray wolf. And even now, 50 years sence, long atter ole Dan is died and dried up in the woods, his haunt and Mahaly's hangs roun' dat piece of low groun', and everybody what goes 'bout there has some bad luck or 'nother, fer haunts don't lack ter be disturbed on dey own stompin' groun'. The air had darkened while the old man related this harrowing tale. The rising wind whistled around the eaves, slammed the loose window shutters, and, still increasing, drove the rain in fiercer gusts into the piazza. As Julius finished his story, and we rose to seek shelter within doors, the blast caught the angle of some chimney or gable in the rear of the house, and bore to our ears a long wailing note, an epitome, as it were, of remorse and hopelessness. "Dat's just like po' ole Dan used to howl," observed Julius as he reached for his umbrella. "And what I be'n tellin' you is de reason I don't lack ter see dat neck er woods cleared up. 'Cause it belongs to you, and a man kin do as he choose wid his own. But ef you gits rheumatiz, er fever and ague, er ef you're a snake bit er poison wid some yerb er 'nother, er ef a tree falls on you, or a haunt runs you and makes you git 'stracted in yo' min', like some folks I knows w'at went foolin' roun' dat piece er lan', you can't say I neber warned you, suh, and told you w'at you might look fer and be sho' ter find." When I cleared up the land in question, which was not until the following year, I recalled the story Julius had told us, and looked in vain for a sunken grave or perhaps a few weather-bleached bones of some denizen of the forest. I cannot say, of course, that some one had not been buried there, but if so, the hand of time had long since removed any evidence of the fact. If some lone wolf, the last of his pack, had once made his den there, his bones had long since crumbled into dust and gone to fertilize the rank vegetation that formed the undergrowth of this wild spot. I did find, however, a bee tree in the woods, with an ample cavity in its trunk, and an opening through which convenient access could be had to the stores of honey within. I have reason to believe that ever since I had bought the place, and for many years before, Julius had been getting honey from this tree. The gray wolf's haunt had doubtless proved useful in keeping off too inquisitive people who might have interfered with his monopoly. End of The Gray Wolf's Haunt. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 7 of The Conjure Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. Section 7 of The Conjure Woman by Charles Waddell CHESNUTT. Hotfoot Hannibal. I hate you and despise you. I wish never to see you or speak to you again. Very well, I will take care that henceforth you have no opportunity to do either. These words, the first in the passionately vibrant tones of my sister-in-law, and the latter in the deeper and more restrained accents of an angry man, startled me from my nap. I had been dozing in my hammock on the front piazza, behind the honeysuckle vine. I had been faintly aware of a buzz of conversation in the parlor, but had not at all awakened to its import until these sentences fell, or I might rather say were hurled upon my ear. I presume the young people had either not seen me lying there, the Venetian blinds opening from the parlor windows upon the piazza were partly closed on account of the heat, or else in their excitement they had forgotten my proximity. I felt somewhat concerned. The young man, I had remarked, was proud, firm, jealous of the point of honor, and, from my observation of him, quite likely to resent to the bitter end what he deemed a slight or an injustice. The girl, I knew, was quite as high-spirited as young Murchison. I feared she was not so just, and hoped she would prove more yielding. I knew that her affections were strong and enduring, but that her temperament was capricious and her sunniest moods easily overcast by some small cloud of jealousy or pique. I had never imagined, however, that she was capable of such intensity as was revealed by these few words of hers. As I say, I felt concerned. I had learned to like Malcolm Murchison, and had heartily consented to his marriage with my ward. for it was in that capacity that I had stood for a year or two to my wife's younger sister, Mabel. The match, thus rudely broken off, had promised to be another link binding me to the kindly Southern people among whom I had not long before taken up my residence. Young Murchison came out of the door, cleared the piazza in 2 strides without seeming aware of my presence, and went off down the lane at a furious pace. A few moments later Mabel began playing the piano loudly, with a touch that indicated anger and pride and independence, and a dash of exultation, as though she were really glad that she had driven away forever the young man whom the day before she had loved with all the ardor of a first passion. I hoped that time might heal the breach and bring the 2 young people together again. I told my wife what I had overheard. In return, she gave me Mabel's version of the affair. "I do not see how it can ever be settled," my wife said. "It is something more than a mere lovers' quarrel. It began, it is true, because she found fault with him for going to church with that hateful Branson girl. But before it ended there were things said that no woman of any spirit could stand. I am afraid it is all over between them." I was sorry to hear this. In spite of the very firm attitude taken by my wife and her sister, I still hoped that the quarrel would be made up within a day or 2. Nevertheless, when a week had passed with no word from young Murchison, and with no sign of relenting on Mabel's part, I began to think myself mistaken. One pleasant afternoon, about 10 days after the rupture, old Julius drove the rockaway up to the piazza, and my wife Mabel and I took our seats for a drive to a neighbor's vineyard, over on the Lumberton plank road. "Which way shall we go?" I asked, "the short road or the long one?" "I guess we had better take the short road," answered my wife. "We will get there sooner." "It's a mighty fine drive round by the big road, Miss Annie," observed Julius, "and it don't take much longer to get there." "No," said my wife, "I think we will go by the short road. There is a bay tree in blossom near the mineral spring, and I wish to get some of the flowers." "I 'specs you'd find some bay trees 'long the big road, ma'am," suggested Julius. "But I know about the flowers on the short road, and they are the ones I want." We drove down the lane to the highway, and soon struck into the short road leading past the mineral spring. Our route lay partly through a swamp, and on each side the dark, umbrageous foliage, unbroken by any clearing, lent to the road solemnity, and to the air a refreshing coolness. About half a mile from the house, and about halfway to the mineral spring, we stopped at the tree of which my wife had spoken, and reaching up to the low-hanging boughs, I gathered a dozen of the fragrant white flowers. When I resumed my seat in the rockaway, Julius started the mare. She went on for a few rods, until we had reached the edge of a branch crossing the road, when she stopped short. "Why did you stop, Julius?" I asked. "I didn't, suh," he replied. "'Twas the mare stop. Get 'long there, Lucy. What you mean by this foolishness?" Julius jerked the reins and applied the whip lightly, but the mare did not stir. "Perhaps you had better get down and lead her," I suggested. "If you get her started, you can cross on the log and keep your feet dry." Julius alighted, took hold of the bridle, and vainly essayed to make the mare move. She planted her feet with even more evident obstinacy. "I don't know what to make of this," I said. "I have never known her to balk before. Have you, Julius?" "No, suh," replied the old man. "I never has. It's a cur'ous thing to me, suh." "What's the best way to make her go?" "I 'spects, suh, dat ef I'd turn her roun', she'd go de other way." "But we want her to go this way." "Well, suh, I 'low ef we jes' set here fer 5 minutes, she'll start up by herself." "All right," I rejoined. "It is cooler here than any place I have struck to day. We'll let her stand for a while, and see what she does." We had sat in silence for a few minutes, when Julius suddenly ejaculated, Uh-huh. I knows why this mare don't go. It just flashed across my recommembrance." "Why is it, Julius?" I inquired. "'Cause she sees Chloe." "Where is Chloe?" I demanded. "Chloe done been dead these 40 years or mo'," the old man returned. "Her haunt is settin' over yonder on the other side of the branch, under that willow tree, this blessed minute." "Why, Julius," said my wife, "do you see the haunt?" "No," he answered, shaking his head, "I don't see her, but the mare sees her." "How do you know?" I inquired. "Well, suh, this here is a gray hoss, and this here is a Friday, and a gray hoss can alluz see a haunt what walks on Friday." "Who is Chloe?" said Mabel. "And why does Chloe's haunt walk?" asked my wife. "It's all in the tale, ma'am," Julius replied, with a deep sigh. "It's all in the tale." "Tell us the tale," I said. "Perhaps by the time you get through, the haunt will go away and the mare will cross." I was willing to humor the old man's fancy. He had not told us a story for some time, and the dark and solemn swamp around us, the amber-colored stream flowing silently and sluggishly at our feet, like the waters of Lethe, the heavy aromatic scent of the bays faintly suggestive of funeral wreaths, all made the place an ideal one for a ghost story. "Chloe," Julius began in a subdued tone, "used to belong to old Mars Dugal' McAdoo, my old master. She was a likely gal and a smart gal, and ole Miss took her up to the big house and learned her to wait on the white folks, till by she come to be Miss's own maid, and 'peared to 'low she run the house herself, to hear her talk about it. I was a young boy den, and used to work 'bout the stables, so I knowed everything dat was gwine on roun' the plantation. Well, one time Mars Dugal' wanted a houseboy, and sont down to the quarters fer to hab Jeff and Hannibal come up to the big house nex' mornin'. Ole Marster and ole Miss looked the two boys ober, and 'scussed wid derselves fer a little while, and den Mars Dugal' says he, 'We likes Hannibal de bes', and we gwine ter keep 'im. Hey, Hannibal, you'll work at de house fum now on, and ef you a good nigger and minds yo' business, I'll give you Chloe fer a wife nex' spring. You other nigger, you, Jeff, you kin go back to the quarters. We ain' gwine ter need you.' Now Chloe had been standin' dere behin' ole Miss doin' all dis yer talk, and Chloe made up her min' fum de ve'y fus' minute she sot eyes on dem two dat she didn't like dat nigger Hannibal, and wa'n't never gwine ter keer fer 'im, and she was jes' ez sho' dat she liked Jeff, and was gwine ter set sto' by 'im, whether Mars Dugal' took 'im in de big house er no. And so, co'se, Chloe was monst'us sorry w'en ole Mars Dugal' took Hannibal and sont Jeff back. So she slipped roun' de house and waylaid Jeff on de way back to de quarters, and tol' him not ter be downhearted, fer she was gwine ter see ef she couldn't fin' some way er nudder ter git rid er dat nigger Hannibal, and git Jeff up to de house in his place. De new houseboy cotch on monst'us fas', and it wa'n't no time hardly befo' Mars Dugal' and ole Miss bofe commenced ter 'low Hannibal was de bes' houseboy dey eber had. He was peart and supple, quick ez lightnin', and sharp ez a razor. But Chloe didn't like his ways. He was so sho' he was gwine ter git her in de spring dat it didn't 'pear ter 'low he had ter do any co'tin', and w'en he'd run 'cross Chloe 'bout de house, he'd swell roun' her in a biggity way, and say, 'Come here and kiss me, honey, you gwine ter be mine in de spring. You don't 'pear ter be ez fon' of me ez you oughter be.' Chloe didn't keer nuffin fer Hannibal, and hadn't keered nuffin fer 'im, and she sot jes' ez much sto' by Jeff as she did de day she fus' laid eyes on 'im. And de mo' familiar dis yer Hannibal got, de mo' Chloe let her min' run on Jeff, and one evenin' she went down to de quarters and watch' till she got a chance fer ter talk wid 'im by herse'f. And she tol' Jeff fer ter go down and see ole Aun Peggy, de Conjure Woman down by de Wilmington Road, and ax her ter give 'im somethin' ter help git Hannibal out'n de big house, so de white folks 'u'd sen' fer Jeff ag'in. And bein' ez Jeff didn't have nuffin ter give Aun Peggy, Chloe gun 'im a silver dollar and a silk handkerchief fer ter pay her wid, fer Aun Peggy nebber liked ter work fer nobody fer nuffin. So Jeff slip off down to Aun Peggy's one night and gunted a present he brung her, and told her all about him and Chloe and Hannibal, and asked her to help him out. Aun Peggy told him she'd work her roots, and for him to come back the next night, and she'd tell him what she could do for him. So the next night Jeff went back, and Aun Peggy gun him a baby doll with a body made out in a piece of cornstalk, and with splinters for arms and legs, and a head made out in elderberry pith, and 2 little red peppers for feet. This here baby doll, says she, is Hannibal. This here pith head is Hannibal's head, and these here pepper feet is Hannibal's feet. You take this and hide it under the house, on the sill under the door, where Hannibal have to walk over it every day. And as long as Hannibal comes anywhere near this baby doll, he'll be just like it is, light-headed and hot-footed. And if them 2 things don't get him into trouble mighty soon, then I'm no Conjure Woman. But when you get Hannibal back out in the house and get all through with this baby doll, you must fetch it back to me, for it's monstrous powerful goofer, and is liable to make more trouble if you leave it laying around. Well, Jeff took the baby doll and slipped up to the big house and whistled to Chloe, and when she come out he told her what old Aun Peggy had said, and Chloe showed him how to get under the house, and when he had put the conjure doll on the sill, he went along back to the quarters and just waited. Next day, sure enough, the goofer commenced to work. Hannibal started in the house soon in the morning with an armful of wood to make a fire, and he hadn't more than got across the door sill before his feet begun to burn, so that he dropped the armful of wood on the floor and woke old Miss up an hour sooner than usual. And, 'course, old Miss didn't like that and spoke sharp about it. When dinner time come, and Hannibal was helping to cook care of the dinner from the kitchen into the big house, and was getting close to the door where he had to go in, his feet started to burn, and his head began to swim, and it let the big dish of chicken and dumplings fall right down in the dirt, in the middle of the yard, and the white folks had to make their dinner that day off in cold ham and sweet taters. The next morning he overslept himself, and got into more trouble. After breakfast, Mars Dugal sent him over to Mars Marable Utley's for to borrow a monkey wrench. He ought to been back in half an hour, but he come poking home about dinner time with a screwdriver instead of a monkey wrench. Mars Dugal sent another nigger back with the screwdriver, and Hannibal didn't get no dinner. Along in the afternoon, old Miss sought Hannibal to weedin' the flowers in the front garden, and Hannibal dug up all the bulbs old Miss had sent away for, and paid a lot of money for, and took 'em down to the hog pen by the barnyard and fed 'em to the hogs. When old Miss come out in the cool of the evening and seed what Hannibal had done, she was most crazy, and she wrote a note and sent Hannibal down to the overseer with it. But what Hannibal got from the overseer didn't appear to do no good. Every now and then his feet had commenced to torment him, and his mind would get all mixed up, and his conduct keep getting worser and worser, till finally the white folks couldn't stand it no longer, and Mars Dugal took Hannibal back down to the quarters. "Mrs. Smith," says Mars Dugal to the overseer, "this here nigger's done got so trifling here lately that we can't keep him in the house no more, and I's fotch him to you to be straightened up. You's had occasion to deal with him once, so he knows what to expect. You just take him in hand and let me know how he turns out. And when the hands come in from the field this evening, you can send that yellow nigger Jeff up to the house. I'll try him and see if he's any better than Hannibal." So Jeff went up to the big house and pleased Mars Dugal and old Miss and the rest of the family so well that they all got to lacking him first rate, and they'd have forgot all about Hannibal if it hadn't been for the bad reports what come up from the quarters about him for a month or so. Fact is that Chloe and Jeff were so interested in one another since Jeff been up to the house that they forgot all about taking the baby doll back to Aun Peggy, and it kept working for a while and making Hannibal's feet burn more or less, till all the folks on the plantation got to calling him Hotfoot Hannibal. He kept getting more and more trifling, till he got the name of being the most no-countest nigger on the plantation, and Mars Dugal had to threaten to sell him in the spring, when by and by the goofer quit working, and Hannibal commenced to pick up some and make folks set a little more store by him. Now this here Hannibal was a monstrous smart nigger, and when he got rid of them soft feet, his mind kept running on his other troubles. Here 3 or 4 weeks before, he'd had a easy job waiting on the white folks, living off in the fat of the land, and promised the finest gal on the plantation for a wife in the spring, and now here he was back in the cornfield with the overseer cussing and a raring if he didn't get a hard task done, with nothing but cornbread and bacon and molasses to eat, and all the field hands making remarks and poking fun at him 'cause he'd been sent back from the big house to the field. And the more Hannibal studied about it, the more madder he got, till he finally swore he was going to get even with Jeff and Chloe if it was the last act. So Hannibal slipped away from the quarters one Sunday and hid in the corn up close to the big house till he see Chloe going down the road. He waylaid her and says he, "Howdy, Chloe." "I ain't got no time for the fool with field hands," says Chloe, tossing her head. "What you want with me, Hotfoot?" "I wants to know how you and Jeff is getting along." "I 'lows that's none of yo' business, nigger. I don't see what 'casion any common field hand has got to mix in with the affairs of folks what lives in the big house. But if it'll do you any good to know, I might say that me and Jeff is getting along mighty well, and we going to get married in the spring. And you ain't going to be invited to the wedding, nuther." "No, no," says he. "I wouldn't 'spect to be invited to the wedding, a common low-down field hand like I is. But I's glad to hear you and Jeff is getting along so well. I didn't know but what he had commenced to be a little tired." "Tired of me? That's ridiculous," says Chloe. "Why, that nigger lusts me so, I believe he'd go through fire and water for me. That nigger is just wrop up in me." "Uh-huh," says Hannibal. "Then I reckon there must be some other nigger what meets a woman down by the crick in the swamp every Sunday evening, to say nothing about 2 or 3 times a week." "Yes, it is another nigger, and you is a liar when you say it was Jeff." "Maybe I is a liar, and maybe I ain't got good eyes. But lessen I is a liar, and lessen I ain't got good eyes, Jeff is going to meet that woman this evening, 'long 'bout 8 o'clock, right down there by the crick in the swamp, 'bout halfway betwixt this plantation and Mars Marrabo Utley's." Well, Chloe told Hannibal she didn't believe a word he said, and called him a low-down nigger who was trying to slander Jeff 'cause he was more lucky than he was. But all the same, she couldn't keep her mind from running on what Hannibal had said. She remembered she'd heard one of the niggers say there was a gal over at Mars Marrabo Utley's plantation what Jeff used to go with some before he got acquainted with Chloe. Then she commenced to figure back, and sure enough there was 2 or 3 times in the last week when she'd been helping the ladies with their dressing and other fixings in the evening, and Jeff might have gone down to the swamp without her knowing about it at all. And then she commenced to remember little things which she had took no notice of before, and what'd make it appear like Jeff had something on his mind. Chloe set a monstrous heap of store by Jeff, and would have done most anything for him, so long as he stuck to her. But Chloe was a mighty jealous woman, and while she didn't believe what Hannibal said, she see how it could have been so, and she determined to find out for herself whether it was so or no. Now Chloe hadn't seen Jeff all day, for Mars Dugal had sent Jeff over to his daughter's house, young Miss Margaret's, what lived about 4 miles from Mars Dugal's, and Jeff wasn't expected home till evening. But just after supper was over, and whiles the ladies was setting out on the piazza, Chloe slipped off from the house and run down the road, this here same road we come. And when she got most to the crick, this here same crick right before us, she kind of kept in the bushes at the side of the road, till finally she seed Jeff sitting on the bank on the other side of the crick, right under that old willow tree dropping over the water yonder. And every now and then he'd get up and look up the road towards Mars Marrabo's on the other side of the swamp. First, Chloe felt like she'd go right over the crick and give Jeff a piece of her mind. Then she 'lowed she better be sure before she done anything. So she held herself in best she could, getting madder and madder every minute, till by and by she seed a woman coming down the road on the other side from towards Mars Marrabo Utley's plantation. And when she see Jeff jump up and run towards that woman and throw his arms round her neck, po' Chloe didn't stop to see no more, but just turned round and run up to the house and rush up on the piazza and up and told Mars Dugal and ole Miss all about the baby doll and all about Jeff getting a goofer from Aunt Peggy and about what the goofer had done to Hannibal. Mars Dugal was monstrous mad. He didn't let on at first like he believed Chloe, but when she took and showed him where to find the baby doll, Mars Dugal turned white as chalk. "What devil's work is this?" says he. "No wonder the po' nigger's feet itched. Something got to be done to lunt that old witch to keep her hands off my niggers. And as for this here Jeff, I'm going to do just what I promised, so the darkies on this plantation 'll know I means what I says." For Mars Dugal had warned the hands before about fooling with conjuration. Fact, he had lost one or two niggers himself from they being goofed, and he would have had old Aunt Peggy whipped long ago, only Aunt Peggy was a free woman, and he was feared she'd conjure him. And whilst Mars Dugal say he didn't believe in conjuring and such, he 'peared to allow it was best to be on the safe side and let Aunt Peggy alone. So Mars Dugal done just as he say. If ole Miss had plead for Jeff, it might have kept him. But ole Miss hadn't got over losing them bulbs yet, and she never said a word. Mars Dugal took Jeff to town next day and sold him to a speculator, who started down the river with him next morning on a steamboat for to take him to Alabama. Now, when Chloe told old Mars Dugal about this here baby doll and this other goofer, she hadn't hardly allowed Mars Dugal would sell Jeff down south. Howsomever, she was so mad with Jeff that she sweated herself she didn't care, and so she held her head up and went round looking like she was real glad about it. But one day she was walking down the road, when who should come along but this here Hannibal. When Hannibal seed her, he bust out laughing fitting for to kill. "Ya, ya, ya, ho, 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 ha, ha, ha. Oh, hold me, honey, hold me. I'll laugh myself to death. I ain't never laughed so much since I been born." "What you laughing at, Hotfoot?" "Yeah, yeah, yeah, what I laughing at? Why, I's laughing at myself, to be sure. Laughing to think what a fine woman I made." Chloe turned pale, and her heart come up in her mouth. "What you mean, nigger?" says she, catching holt of a bush by the road for to steady herself. "What you mean by the kind of woman you made?" "What do I mean? I means that I got squared up with you for treating me the way you done, and I got even with that yeller nigger Jeff for cutting me out. Now he's going to know what it is to eat cornbread and molasses once more, and work from daylight to dark, and to have a overseer driving him from one day's end to the other. I means that I sent word to Jeff that Sunday that you was going to be over to Mars Maribel's visiting that evening, and you want him to meet you down by the creek on the way home and go the rest of the road with you. And then I put on a frock and a sunbonnet and fixed myself up to look like a woman, and when Jeff seed me coming, he run to meet me, and you seed him, for I'd been a-watching in the bushes before and discovered you coming down the road. And now I reckon you and Jeff both knows what it means to mess with a nigger like me." Po' Chloe hadn't heerd more than half of the last part of what Hannibal said, but she had heerd enough to learnt that this nigger had fooled her and Jeff, and that po' Jeff hadn't done nothing, and that for loving her too much and going to meet her, she had caused him to be sold away, where she'd never see him no more. The sun might shine by day, the moon by night, the flowers might bloom, and the mockingbirds might sing, but po' Jeff was done lost to her forever and forever. Hannibal hadn't more than finished what he had to say when Chloe's knees gun away under her, and she fell down in the road and lay there half an hour or so before she come to. When she did, she crept up to the house just as pale as a ghost. And for a month or so she crawled round the house and 'peared to be so po'ly that Mars Dugal sent for a doctor, and the doctor kept on asking her questions till he found she was just pining away for Jeff. When he told Mars Dugal laughed and said he fixed that. She could have the new houseboy for a husband. But ole Miss say no, Chloe ain't that kind of gal, and that Mars Dugal should buy Jeff back. So Mars Dugal writ a letter to this here speculator down to Wilmington, and told if he ain't sold that nigger south what he bought from him, he'd like to buy him back again. Chloe commenced to pick up a little when ole Miss told about this letter. Howsomever, By Mars' Dugal' got an answer from de speculator, who said he was monst'us sorry, but Jeff had fell overboard er jump off'n de steamboat on de way to Wim'l'ton, en got drown', en co'se he couldn't sell 'im back, much ez he'd like ter 'bleedge Mars' Dugal'. Well, atter Chloe heerd dis, she wa'n't much mo' use ter nobody. She purtended ter do her wuk, en ole Miss put up wid her, en had de doctor give her medicine, en let her go ter de circus en all sorts er things fer ter take her min' off'n her troubles, but dey didn't none of 'em do no good. Chloe got ter slippin' down here in de evenin' jes' like she 'uz comin' ter meet Jeff, en she set dere under dat willer tree on de udder side en wait fer 'im night atter night. By she got so bad de w'ite folks sont her ober ter young Miss Margaret's fer ter give her a change, but she runned away de fus' night, en w'en dey looked fer her de nex' mornin', dey foun' her corpse layin' in de branch yonder, right 'cross fum whar we settin' now. Eber sence den," said Julius in conclusion, "Chloe's ha'nt comes eve'y evenin' en sits down under dat willer tree en waits fer Jeff er else walks up en down de road yonder, lookin' en waitin' fer a sweetheart w'at ain' neber eber come back ter her no mo'." There was silence when the old man had finished, and I am sure I saw a tear in my wife's eye, and more than one in Mabel's. "I think, Julius," said my wife, after a moment, "that you may turn the mare around and go by the long road." The old man obeyed with alacrity, and I noticed no reluctance on the mare's part. "You are not afraid of Chloe's haunt, are you?" I asked jocularly. My mood was not responded to, and neither of the ladies smiled. "Oh, no," said Annie, "but I've changed my mind. I prefer the other route." When we had reached the main road, and had proceeded along it for a short distance, we met a cart driven by a young negro, and on the cart were a trunk and a valise. We recognized the man as Malcolm Murchison's servant, and drew up a moment to speak to him. "Who's going away, Marshal?" I inquired. "Young Mr. Malcolm gwine away on de boat to New York dis evenin', suh, en I'm takin' his things down to de wharf, suh." This was news to me, and I heard it with regret. My wife looked sorry, too, and I could see that Mabel was trying hard to hide her concern. "He's comin' 'long behind, suh, en I 'spects she'll meet him up de road a piece. He's gwine ter walk down ez fur ez Mr. Jim Williams's, en take de buggy fum dere ter town. He 'spects ter be gone a long time, suh, en say prob'ly he ain' never comin' back." The man drove on. There were few words exchanged in an undertone between my wife and Mabel, which I did not catch. Then Annie said, "Julius, you may stop the rockaway a moment. There are some trumpet flowers by the road there that I want. Will you get them for me, John?" I sprang into the underbrush, and soon returned with a great bunch of scarlet blossoms. "Where is Mabel?" I asked, noting her absence. "She has walked on ahead. We shall overtake her in a few minutes." The carriage had gone only a short distance when my wife discovered that she had dropped her fan. "I had it where we were stopping. Julius, will you go back and get it for me?" Julius got down and went back for the fan. He was an unconscionably long time finding it. After we got started again, we had gone only a little way when we saw Mabel and young Murchison coming toward us. They were walking arm in arm, and their faces were aglow with the light of love. I do not know whether or not Julius had a previous understanding with Malcolm Murchison, by which he was to drive us round by the long road that day, nor do I know exactly what motive influenced the old man's exertions in the matter. He was fond of Mabel, but I was old enough and knew Julius well enough to be skeptical of his motives. It is certain that a most excellent understanding existed between him and Murchison after the reconciliation, and that when the young people set up housekeeping over at the old Murchison place, Julius had an opportunity to enter their service. For some reason or other, however, he preferred to remain with us. The mare, I might add, was never known to balk again. End of Hotfoot Hannibal. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. End of The Conjure Woman by Charles Waddell CHESNUTT.